Hey friend, I'm really glad you're here tonight. Before we begin, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It's such a small gesture, but it helps more than you know to keep us going and growing. And while you're here, I'm curious, where are you watching from tonight? Is it stormy where you are, or peacefully quiet? Is it late? Maybe past midnight already? Let me know in the comments. I love reading where everyone is tuning in from and what time it is. It always makes this little sleepy community feel so connected across time zones. Now that we're all cozy and the distractions of the day have faded away, take a deep breath and settle in. Tonight, we're journeying far back to a time when pyramids touched the clouds of myth, when pharaohs spoke with gods, and when the Nile's slow heartbeat governed life and death. Welcome to ancient Egypt. Let's begin with the land itself, not just as geography, but as a living entity. Ancient Egypt was more than a strip of desert civilization flanked by the Nile. To those who lived there, Egypt was a heartbeat pulsing in rhythm with a divine river, a sacred mirror where the heavens and the underworld touched. The Nile wasn't just a waterway, it was a spine, a god's pathway, dividing the land into Upper and Lower Egypt, bringing life with its floods and warnings with its droughts. The people didn't just live beside it, they lived because of it. Each year, the inundation came not as chaos, but as a sacred promise kept. The black silt left behind was a divine signature, proof that the gods had not abandoned them. Now imagine the architecture, not the towering pyramids just yet, but the homes, temples, and gardens that lived and breathed under the sun. In the earliest days, mud brick was the breath of shelter. Simple yet powerful, each brick held the heat of the sun and the moisture of the Nile. Walls were painted not with frivolity, but with stories, scenes of daily life, offerings, funerary rites, boats sailing to eternity. Their homes weren't just places to sleep, they were miniature worlds, balanced between Ma'at, the principle of order, and the creeping threat of chaos. Speaking of Ma'at, let's drift into their beliefs, not just religion as we know it, but a cosmology that wrapped around every action, every grain harvested, every breath taken. Ma'at wasn't a goddess you just worshipped, she was a law you lived by, the invisible weight on your heart at judgment, the reason the stars held their place in the sky. Imagine believing that the feather of truth could literally weigh your soul, that each lie, each betrayal, added weight that could tip your heart into oblivion. That's not just mythology, it's philosophy as spirituality. Their pantheon was vast, but not chaotic. Each god had a face, a domain, a story. Osiris, the murdered king of the afterlife, teaching that death was not an end, but a transition. Isis, the divine mother and magician, protector of kings and seeker of lost pieces. Set, the god of storms and disorder, hated and feared, yet undeniably necessary, because even chaos had its place in their cosmos. And Horus, the falcon-eyed avenger, whose every myth was an echo of rebirth, sovereignty, and justice. Every myth was a mirror. When Set killed Osiris, it wasn't just a tale, it was a reenactment in the rituals of kingship, in the rise of the sun, in the flooding of the Nile. Time wasn't linear to the Egyptians, it was cyclical, like the solar bark that sailed the sky by day and the underworld by night. Even death was just a bend in the river. Their burial customs reflected this eternal cycle. When someone died, they weren't mourned in finality. They were prepared, equipped, and guided. Mummification wasn't grotesque, it was sacred. Every organ had a destiny, every bandage a spell. The Book of the Dead wasn't a book at all, but a personalized guide like a map etched in hieroglyphs, leading through perils and guardians, through the Hall of Two Truths, toward Osiris himself. And there, your heart would be weighed not against deeds, but against truth. If it was lighter than the feather of Ma'at, you passed. If not, the devourer Amit, part lion, crocodile, and hippo, would end your journey. But even in that ending, there was a kind of peace. The Egyptians didn't fear death the way we do, they respected it, prepared for it, lived in harmony with it. Let's talk about the temples, massive, eternal, humming with incense and chanting. They weren't just places to pray. Temples were cosmic engines. They kept the world spinning. The pharaoh wasn't just a ruler, he was the high priest of every temple, the human stand-in for Horus on earth. His job wasn't just to conquer it, was to maintain cosmic order. That meant rituals had to be performed every day, offerings had to be made, hymns had to be sung. If one link in that chain broke, the universe could unravel. The priests were mathematicians, astronomers, healers. They watched the stars, not for curios, but for omens. They read the flight of birds, the alignment of planets, the behavior of crocodiles. Nothing was random. Even dreams were messages, sometimes warnings, sometimes invitations. So now you're starting to see how myth, religion, and daily life weren't separate threads. They were the same linen, woven by the gods, worn by the people. Let's touch briefly on their writing, the sacred script of hieroglyphs. Not just pictures. Each symbol carried sound, meaning, and magic. Writing wasn't just communication, it was invocation. To carve a name into a tomb wall was to ensure that name echoed through eternity. Erase it, and the soul was lost forever. That's why damnatio memoriae, erasing names, was the cruelest punishment. You weren't just killing someone, you were unmaking them. Think about that. Now, as you sink deeper into the calm of this night, hold on to that idea. That stories, names, rituals, and truths are what keep us alive, even after death. In the next part, we'll step inside the temples and walk alongside the gods. But for now, let the soft wind of the Nile lull you. Let the distant chant of priests guide you inward. And sleep, friend. We'll continue soon. The temples of ancient Egypt were more than structures of stone and paint. They were living instruments of divine maintenance, humming with sacred purpose and precise intention. Every inch of their construction, from the alignment of columns to the inscriptions on lintels, was part of an enormous cosmic equation. The outer pylons that greeted the rising sun were carved with tales of the pharaoh's victories, not for vanity, but to declare his worthiness to be the intermediary between mortals and gods. Within, the hypostyle halls were forests of stone columns carved like bundles of papyrus and lotus, echoing the banks of the Nile in an eternal spring. Light barely reached the interiors, filtered through slits and doorways in slow, calculated shafts. The deeper one ventured, the darker it became, until the innermost sanctum, often just a small, quiet chamber, held the god's statue, wrapped and sealed like the mysteries it embodied. These temples were machines designed to keep the universe running smoothly. Priests performed rituals at dawn, noon, and dusk, bathing, dressing, and feeding the statues of gods with offerings of bread, wine, and incense, reciting hymns that had been sung for centuries with barely a change. This wasn't superstition, it was maintenance. As surely as the sun must rise, these rites had to be completed, or risk inviting the forces of Isfet chaos back into the world. The gods, you see, weren't aloof beings sitting in far-off heavens. They were present, embodied in stone and wood and bronze and falcons and bulls and cats. They lived in the breath of the Nile, in the desert winds, in the dreams of kings. And like royalty, they required constant respect and attention. Their moods could shift with the balance of Ma'at. If the people starved or the river failed to flood, it wasn't meteorology, it was cosmological imbalance. That's why the pharaoh bore such a heavy burden. He wasn't simply a king. Crowned by inheritance, he was chosen by the gods and charged with keeping the world in alignment. Each coronation was not just a political event, but a divine reinstallation of balance. The ceremonies lasted days. Crowns were changed white for Upper Egypt, red for Lower, and when the double crown was finally placed, the pharaoh symbolically became Horus on earth, ruling with sight from above and wisdom from below. The rituals weren't optional, they were survival. If the pharaoh failed in his duties, it wasn't just his lineage at risk, it was all of Egypt. That's why rebellions were not just seen as threats to power, but as tears in the very fabric of reality. The punishment wasn't only execution, it was erasure. Names chiseled off monuments, faces scraped away from bas-reliefs, a soul condemned not to oblivion, but to non-existence. And this leads us into one of the more chilling aspects of ancient Egyptian thought, the idea that memory was immortality. To be remembered was to continue. That's why tombs were so elaborate, why names were written over and over, why spells and prayers and portraits surrounded the dead. These weren't decorations, they were reinforcements. Tools to ensure the soul didn't wander, didn't starve, didn't vanish. And the dead had jobs. They were expected to continue assisting their families from the other side. That's where the ushabti come, and those little carved figurines placed by the dozens in tombs. Each one was a servant meant to answer the call when the soul was summoned to do labor in the fields of the afterlife. Imagine being buried with your own workforce for eternity. The afterlife wasn't a vacation. It was continuation, endless, fertile, cyclical. And just as life had duties, so did death. The concept of time in ancient Egypt followed this cycle relentlessly. The sun god Ra sailed his bark across the sky during the day and plunged into the underworld each night, battling monsters and chaos, only to rise again each morning. This solar journey mirrored the soul's path: life, death, trials, rebirth. And just as Ra was aided by gods like Ma'at and Thoth, the soul had its allies to spells, amulets, prayers left behind by the living. Think now of their medicine, not just herbs and potions, but a fusion of magic and science. A wound wasn't simply physical, it could be caused by malevolent forces. A doctor was also a priest, reciting incantations while applying honey or beer-soaked linen. Disease wasn't isolated from morality or fate. The boundary between health and curse was thin. The most powerful physicians were often trained in temple libraries, vast archives of papyrus scrolls, where astronomy, medicine, and theology blurred into one. Even pregnancy had its omens. Women urinated on barley and wheat seeds to determine the sex of the child. If both sprouted, twins were expected. And if neither did, the woman wasn't pregnant. It sounds primitive, but modern tests have shown surprising accuracy. Their knowledge wasn't guesswork. It was empirical, intuitive, and often more accurate than we give it credit for. Let's walk into their markets now, buzzing spaces where daily life pulsed. Scribes hunched over reed pens, measuring out contracts and receipts on parchment. Merchants sold papyrus sandals, glazed amulets, jars of honey, and date wine. Fish sizzled on open fires. Children ran between stalls chasing pet monkeys. It wasn't just royalty that lived with purpose. The farmer in the fields prayed to Renenutet for a good harvest. The sailor left amulets of Bez at the bow to protect against river spirits. Even the servant placing perfume cones on a noblewoman's head knew that scent wasn't just luxury. It was a form of protection against bad spirits. Smell, color, sound, every sense had sacred meaning. Color wasn't decorative, it was magical. Blue invoked the Nile and fertility. Green promised rebirth. Red warned of danger and anger. Black was the fertile soil of life, white the purity of Ma'at. Paintings weren't artistic interpretations, they were spells. A person depicted in profile with perfect features wasn't idealized, they were being eternalized. Imperfection risked corruption in the afterlife. That's why art seemed so repetitive. It wasn't laziness, it was sacred protocol. Breaking it could risk the soul's journey. So much of what we assume was superstition was in fact deeply encoded psychology. They knew the mind could influence the body, that the heart carried memory and judgment, that dreams opened gates. Even music wasn't just entertainment, it was invocation. The sistrum, a rattling instrument, wasn't just for rhythm. It was used to wake statues of gods, to call Hathor, to cleanse spaces of chaos. The whole world of ancient Egypt was alive with unseen threads. Threads connecting human to divine, moment to eternity, gesture to cosmos. And the people who lived then walked carefully along those threads, not out of fear, but out of awe. In the next part, we'll explore the lives of the pharaohs themselves, their rise, their madness, their rituals, and the myths that surrounded them. But for now, let the flicker of oil lamps dim, let the stone halls of the temple grow quiet. and let the Nile whisper you into stillness. We'll continue soon. The pharaoh was never just a man in ancient Egypt, he was a living god, an embodiment of divine will who walked the earth wrapped in linen and gold, crowned not by men, but by the heavens themselves. His face was carved on temples, his name etched on obelisks, his form buried in pyramids, meant to outlast the desert winds. But before he could sit upon the throne, the path to divine kingship was a gauntlet of ritual, myth, and meticulous orchestration designed to transform flesh into legend. From the moment of birth, a future pharaoh's life was not his own. He was secluded, educated, watched constantly by priests and viziers, trained in hieroglyphics, sacred astronomy, warfare, and the art of command. He was told he was the living Horus, the falcon god who avenged his father Osiris and ruled over the skies. That belief wasn't metaphorical. It was absolute. Every gesture he made was sacred. Every decision the continuation of a divine lineage. When a pharaoh died, the transition was not simple succession, it was cosmological continuation. His son didn't just inherit the throne. He inherited the universe's balance. The coronation ceremonies were labyrinths of symbolism. The pharaoh would be washed, shaved, and anointed with oils imported from the lands of Punt, their fragrance intended to carry divine favor. He would don the sacred white tunic, step barefoot onto temple stones, and be presented to the gods in chambers where few mortals had ever stood. The priests chanted hymns that stretched back over 1,000 years, words that hadn't changed since the Old Kingdom, invoking Ma'at, balance, order, and Trut, H. Then came the crowning, not a single crown, but two, the white Hedjet of Upper Egypt and the red Deshret of Lower Egypt. When placed together, they form the Shent, the double crown of unified rule. In that moment, the pharaoh ceased to be merely human. He became Nesubiti, he of the sedge and the bee, a title symbolizing dominion over the entire Nile Valley. His new name was carved into cartouches, ovals of eternity, meant to trap the power of identity forever. He would now be addressed not just by his name, but by his 5 royal titulary titles, including the Horus name, the Nebi name, and the Golden Horus name, each linking him to different aspects of divinity and cosmic function. From that day forward, his life was governed by ritual. At dawn, he offered incense to Ra. At midday, he consulted with high priests and scribes. At dusk, he visited temples or received foreign envoys who trembled before the living God. He wasn't allowed to eat ordinary food. His meals were blessed, measured, symbolic. His wardrobe was regulated linen only, freshly laundered, perfumed. His dreams were interpreted by priest-magicians, his health monitored by physicians who doubled as astrologers. But for all his luxury, the weight was crushing. If the Nile failed to flood, it was his fault. If famine spread, it was because he had angered the gods. If enemies advanced, it was seen as cosmic disorder, and the pharaoh was expected to personally correct it. Many went mad under the burden. Hatshepsut, a woman who declared herself king, wore a false beard, and built monumental temples to prove her legitimacy. Akhenaten shattered tradition, proclaiming a single god, the Aten, and moved the capital into the desert. His own priests rebelled. His legacy was nearly erased. And then there was Ramses II, who ruled for 66 years, built cities of stone, declared himself a god while still alive, and filled the walls of temples with colossal statues of himself. He wasn't humble. He couldn't be. His divinity demanded grandeur. His family, wives, children, even the lesser ones, were tools of dynasty. Some kings married sisters, daughters, even mothers, to keep the bloodline pure, to ensure that no drop of divine essence was diluted. It was horrifying by modern standards, but to them, it was sacred algebra. Even the pharaoh's voice was sacred. When he spoke in public, it was often not his own words, but phrases written by temple scribes, calculated to preserve balance and project divine command. He was an actor in a play written by the cosmos, and the stakes were existence itself. But it wasn't just performance. The rituals were deeply believed. During the said festival, a rejuvenation ceremony held after 30 years of rule, the aging pharaoh would run between markers to prove his vitality. He would hunt wild animals, demonstrate strength, and participate in rites that mimicked the rebirth of the cosmos. Failure wasn't an option. If he faltered, it could mean death, not just personal, but spiritual. To fail as pharaoh meant to invite collapse. And so they built monuments. Pyramids weren't just tombs, they were resurrection engines. Every angle, every chamber, every corridor was a map for the soul's journey into the afterlife. The Book of the Dead wasn't read aloud at funerals. It was a manual for navigating eternity, placed beside the body, inked in black and red on rolls of papyrus that sometimes stretched over 30 feet long. And when a pharaoh died, the mummification process was itself a ritual theater. His brain was removed through the nose, his organs sealed in canopic jars guarded by sons of Horus. His heart was weighed against the feather of Maat, not metaphorically, but in judgment. If it was heavier, he was devoured by the demon Ammit. If lighter, he passed into the field of reeds, where he ruled forever in a realm of endless harvests. The burial was an opera of magic. The tomb was sealed with curses, false doors were painted to confuse robbers, treasure buried in layers to deceive. But despite all precautions, most tombs were looted within decades. The treasures of kings now sit behind glass in museums, their mummies scanned, unwrapped, analyzed. The magic cracked open by modern light, and yet their power persists. We still say their names: Tutankhamun, Ramses, Akhenaten. We marvel at their temples, study their laws, trace their bloodlines. In a way, their magic worked. They are not forgotten. They are eternal. In the next part, we will dive into Egyptian mythology, the tangled pantheon of gods, the monstrous and the divine, the chaos serpents and the sunboats, the goddess of war who drank blood and the jackal-headed judge of the dead. But for now, close your eyes and imagine standing before the colossal statues of Abu Simbel as the sun rises through the temple's axis only twice a year. Hear the silence, feel the stone beneath your feet, and let the gods of Egypt whisper their stories into your dreams. In the beginning, there was only the infinite expanse of the primordial waters, dark, formless, and eternal. This abyss was called None, and from its depths rose the first mound of creation, a small rise of earth piercing the stillness like the first breath after a long silence. Upon this sacred mound stood Adam, the creator, the self-generated god who emerged from nothingness. Adam did not speak the world into existence like in other mythologies. He acted, he wept, he exhaled. From his essence, he produced Shu, the god of air, and Tefnut, the goddess of moisture, and with them, the world began to take shape. These divine siblings birthed Geb, the god of the earth, and Nut, the goddess of the sky. But Geb and Nut, in their embrace, prevented light and movement. And so Shu, the air, separated them, lifting Nut into the heavens and pressing Geb down below. Thus, day and night were born. The skies arched above like a mother reaching forever toward her grounded lover. And with each sunrise and sunset, the ancient Egyptians saw not mere rotation, but divine cycles, rehearsals of creation and rebirth. From Nut's womb came the great gods: Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys. Osiris, regal and wise, was the first king of Egypt, teaching mankind agriculture, justice, and harmony. Isis, his sister and wife, was the mother of magic, the ultimate protector and healer. But Set, the god of chaos and desert storms, was jealous. His heart brimmed with fury, his mind twisted by ambition. In the mythic tragedy that echoed through millennia, Set murdered Osiris, tore his body into pieces, and scattered them across Egypt. Isis, grief-stricken but resolute, wandered the Nile Valley, gathering the remnants of her husband's form. With her magic, she reassembled him, and in a single breathless night, she conceived Horus, the falcon-headed god who would avenge his father. Osiris, now incomplete, could not return to the realm of the living. He descended into Duat, the underworld, and became its eternal king, ruler of the dead, judge of souls. His death was not an end, but a transformation, a blueprint for resurrection. Every pharaoh who died became Osiris, and his successor became Horus, renewing the cosmic order. Horus and Set battled for years. Their war shook the heavens. They transformed into animals, wrestled atop mountain peaks, sought judgment in divine courts. In the end, Horus triumphed, not by strength alone, but through wisdom, patience, and the support of the gods. This struggle between order and chaos, Ma'at and Isfet, became the very foundation of Egyptian thought. The gods weren't distant creators, they were forces intertwined with every moment of life. Ra, the sun god, rode across the sky each day in his solar bark, bringing warmth and sight to the world. But each night, he traveled through the underworld, facing Apophis, the chaos serpent, who tried to devour the light. In these nightly battles, the gods joined him. Set, once a villain, now stood at the prow of the ship, defending the sun from annihilation. Even the most feared god had a role in sustaining balance. Every sunrise was a victory, every dawn a miracle. The Egyptian pantheon was vast and complex, with gods that had overlapping domains, changing forms, and blended identities. Amun, the Hidden One, merged with Ra to become Amun-Ra, king of the gods. Baste, the cat goddess of home and fertility, could become Sekhmet, the lioness of war and plague, when angered. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, wrote the laws of the universe and recorded the weight of every soul. Anubis, jackal-headed, guided the dead to judgment. He was not feared, he was trusted. In tomb paintings, he gently holds the hands of the departed, leading them to Osiris. Magic Heka was not fantasy. It was a divine energy that permeated existence, wielded by gods and men alike. Priests performed rituals that mirrored the actions of the gods. Every temple was a microcosm of the cosmos, every rite a reenactment of creation. The high priest of Amun bathed 4 times a day, changed into pure linen, and spoke in hushed tones because his words echoed across dimensions. The temples themselves were designed as sacred journeys. You entered through pylons representing the horizon, passed through courtyards symbolizing the world, and ended in the sanctum, the primeval mound where the statue of the god stood in silence and power. Offerings were made not to bribe, but to nourish. The gods were not omnipotent. They needed devotion to maintain their presence. If neglected, they could weaken, retreat, or transform into wrathful forces. Festivals erupted across Egypt to honor these beings. During Opet, the statue of Amun traveled from Karnak to Luxor, veiled from the masses but believed to renew creation itself. Drums beat, incense filled the air, boats floated down the Nile like glowing stars. People wept with joy just to glimpse the sacred. Children were named after gods, homes painted with protective spells, amulets shaped like eyes, beetles, and ankhs were worn daily. Every facet of life, birth, sickness, love, harvest, was tied to the mythic. Dreams were messages, shadows were omens. The world was not random, it was layered with meaning. Every act part of a divine story told since time began. Even animals were sacred. Crocodiles were linked to Sobek, fierce and strong. Ibis birds followed Thoth. Cats were adored for their link to Bastet. Killing one, even by accident, could provoke mourning rituals. In some temples, live animals were kept, fed, revered, and mummified after death. They were gods in fur and feather. The stories of the gods were carved into obelisks, painted in tombs, whispered in marketplaces. They weren't just mythology, they were identity. A farmer harvesting grain knew he did so because Osiris gave it. A mother prayed to Hathor for safe childbirth. A soldier invoked Montu before battle. These weren't abstract figures, they were companions, guardians. Models of how to live, how to die, how to be reborn. And when life ended, it was the gods who stood waiting. In the next part, we'll walk the sacred roads of ancient cities, Thebes, Memphis, Abydos, and stand before towering obelisks and silent pyramids. But for now, close your eyes and let the voices of Isis and Horus echo softly, like wind across desert stone. Let the stars above become the body of Nut, and let your heartbeat sync with the rhythm of Ra's eternal voyage. In the golden light of the Nile's early morning, when mist still clung to the water's edge and papyrus swayed in a breeze older than memory, the monuments of ancient Egypt began to whisper their secrets. The land itself was divided not only by geography, but by sacred meaning. The east was the land of the living, where the sun rose and cities thrived, while the west, where the sun set, was the land of the dead, home to necropolises and the gates to the afterlife. It was no accident that temples were built on the eastern bank and tombs carved into the western cliffs, everything aligned with cosmic purpose. As the sun climbed higher, it illuminated the immense stone facades of temples that dwarfed even the tallest palm trees. Karnak, Luxor, Edfu, each temple was a universe in stone, planned not by whim but by sacred geometry. The pylons at their entrance rose like twin mountains, representing the horizon between worlds. You would step through them and be transformed, passing from the human realm into the divine. Colossal statues flanked the entrance's pharaohs, seated with eternal gaze, their hands resting calmly upon knees, eyes watching forever. Beyond, massive courtyards opened into hypostyle halls filled with rows upon rows of stone columns, so wide you could not wrap your arms around them. Each column was carved to resemble bundles of papyrus or lotus symbols of life and rebirth. The ceilings were painted deep blue, speckled with golden stars. You were not indoors. You were beneath the sky of creation itself. And in the very heart of the temple, behind doors only priests could open, stood the sanctuary, a small dark chamber holding a statue of the god, hidden and silent, the axis of all meaning. Only the high priest could enter. Only he could speak to the divine. Yet even outside, pilgrims came daily, bearing offerings of bread, beer, incense, and flowers. Music played. Sistrums rattled in praise of Hathor. Prayers were spoken aloud or etched into walls. The gods were not silent. They responded in dreams, in omens, in the flicker of flame or the flight of birds. These temples were not abandoned relics, but living engines of faith. And far from the temples, across the Nile in the arid desert, rose another sacred marvel: the pyramids. The most famous stand at Giza, enduring for over 40 years as the last of the ancient wonders. But they were not just tombs. They were resurrection machines, spiritual engines that aimed to propel the pharaoh's soul into the afterlife and beyond. Their shape echoed the rays of the sun, slanting upward toward the heavens. Inside, narrow shafts aligned perfectly with stars believed to be gates to the next world. The Great Pyramid of Khufu was once encased in smooth white limestone that reflected the sun, glowing like a celestial beacon. No tools, no technology from that age, fully explains the precision. How the blocks, some weighing over 50 tons, were moved remains a mystery. Theories abound, but what matters more is what they meant. These were not monuments to ego, but to eternity. The Egyptians believed that to name something was to give it life. To build something immense and enduring was to ensure that name would never die. But most Egyptians did not live among pyramids or temples. They lived in mud brick homes, along irrigation canals, in villages shaded by date palms, in homes built low to the ground to stay cool in the relentless sun. Their lives were humble but rhythmic, shaped by the seasons of the Nile. The river flooded predictably each year, and with it came rich black silt called kemet that made the fields fertile. Farmers used wooden plows pulled by oxen. They sowed wheat and barley, harvested flax for linen. Daily life began before sunrise. Women baked flatbread in clay ovens. Children chased goats through dusty courtyards. Men worked the fields, painted homes with whitewash to reflect the heat. Evenings were for rest, for songs and games, for quiet prayers spoken into the dark. Hieroglyphs carved into tombs, and stelae did not record only the deeds of kings. They told of bakers and brewers, dancers, and scribes. The scribe held a special place in Egyptian society. With reed pen and ink made of soot and ochre, they recorded taxes, legal rulings, harvests, and hymns. To read and write was to possess magic. It was a skill not of the hands, but of the divine mind. The children of scribes learned in temple schools, repeating proverbs like, "Writing is the mother of eloquence," or, "A scribe does not sweat in the sun." And in medicine, too, the Egyptians excelled. They performed surgeries, cataloged hundreds of ailments, and used a blend of spiritual and herbal healing. A doctor might recite an incantation while applying honey to a wound. To them, health was balance between body and spirit, between man and God. Music was constant. Harps, lutes, and flutes filled the air. People danced in honor of Hathor. Women wore scented cones of perfumed wax on their heads that melted through the night. Festivals lit up the land. Boats with golden sails glided down the Nile during processions. Even commoners felt part of the divine rhythm, and the tombs far beyond the grandeur of pyramids were crafted with love and care. In the Valley of the Kings, tombs were carved into stone cliffs, each chamber painted with scenes from the Book of the Dead, maps and prayers to guide the soul. Burial was not an end, it was a journey. The dead were washed, anointed, wrapped in linen, and entombed with shabdi dolls to work for them in the next life. Amulets were tucked between layers eyes of Horus, scarabs, ankhs, and above all, the name was written, for to be forgotten was the second death. The first was of the body, the second of memory. And the Egyptians, more than any people, feared being erased. So they built, wrote, and prayed with one goal: to endure. In the next part, we'll explore the afterlife itself, its perils, its promises, and the trials every soul had to face. But for now, listen to the hush of the Nile under moonlight. Feel the presence of stone columns reaching for stars. And remember that here, in this land of sun and sand, even time itself bowed before belief. In the quiet spaces between day and night, when the horizon blurs and the desert winds fall still, the ancient Egyptians believed that another realm became accessible, a place both feared and longed for. A realm not of life, but of continuation, where the dead walked through trials and wonders in search of eternity. The afterlife was not a vague idea. It was mapped in sacred texts, painted on tomb walls, whispered in funerary chants, and etched into amulets. To them, death was a journey, not an end, and the underworld Duat was as real as the Nile or the pyramids that pointed toward the heavens. When a person died, their soul began a perilous voyage. The physical body, called the Khat, was preserved through mummification, wrapped in linen and surrounded by spells and charms. But the true self, the Ba, depicted as a human-headed bird, and the Ka, the life force, continued beyond. Together they traveled through Duat, a realm of night and shadow, light and illusion, where rivers ran with fire and serpents with many heads guarded narrow gates. This was no simple stroll. Each stage of Duat presented obstacles, demons to evade, gates to name, questions to answer. Only those who had studied the Book of the Dead, properly named the Book of Coming Forth by Day, could hope to pass. This scroll, often buried with the deceased, contained spells and guidance, sometimes more than 20 meters long, painted with vibrant images and carefully written in hieroglyphs by skilled scribes. And still, even that was not enough. At the heart of Duat lay the Hall of Two Truths. Here, under the watchful eyes of 42 judges and the god Thoth, the soul stood before Osiris, the green-skinned lord of the underworld, seated on a throne of gold and lapis, crowned with ostrich feathers and flanked by the silent presence of Isis and Nephthys. Before Osiris stood the scales of justice. On one side was the feather of Ma'at, goddess of truth and cosmic order. On the other, the deceased's heart removed during mummification, then magically restored for this moment. If the heart was heavier than the feather, bloated with lies, cruelty, and wrongdoing, then the soul was devoured by Amit, the devourer, a terrifying beast part lion, crocodile, and hippopotamus. To be eaten by Amit was to die the final death, no rebirth, no memory, no name. But if the heart balanced or weighed less, then the soul was justified, declared Ma'acheru, true of voice and allowed to enter the field of reeds. This was paradise. Imagine golden fields stretching endlessly beneath a gentle sun, where the air was soft and harvests never failed. The soul would live here forever, reunited with loved ones, working the fields but without pain or hunger. It was the perfect mirror of life, free from its sorrows. The Egyptians did not fear death as annihilation. They feared injustice, being unprepared, or most dreadful of all, being forgotten. Their tombs were not made for decay but for eternity. Their names were spoken in rituals, their images carved on stone, so that each prayer would revive them just a little. Even kings, with all their power, needed protection. Tombs in the Valley of the Kings were lined with spells from the Amduat and the Book of Gates, other sacred texts that mapped the underworld with incredible precision. Gods with animal heads guarded hour by hour. Ra himself journeyed through Duat each night, battling the serpent Apophis, so that he might rise again at dawn. The king, in death, hoped to join Ra's boat, to sail with the sun into the next world. Grave goods were not decorative. Food, sandals, combs, beds, games, even miniature servants called shaptis were placed in the tomb. These figures would magically work in the afterlife on behalf of the dead. Amulets like the D-Jade pillar, representing stability, or the Ankh, symbolizing life, were tucked between bandages. Eyes of Horus, scarabs, and Wedjat symbols offered protection and healing. Mummies were often placed in multiple coffins, each adorned with painted faces and hieroglyphs, calling on the gods. The outer coffin might bear the image of Nut, sky goddess, arching over the body, offering rebirth like the stars. Rituals did not end at burial. The opening of the mouth ceremony, performed by priests or the eldest son, was crucial. Using special tools, they would symbolically restore the senses of the deceased so they could eat, speak, and see in the afterlife. Without it, the soul risked becoming trapped. Annual festivals like the beautiful Feast of the Valley allowed families to visit tombs, bring offerings, and commune with the dead. For the Egyptians, the barrier between life and death was porous, shifting, never sealed. They dreamed of the dead, saw their presence in birds, shadows, or gentle breezes. Sometimes the dead wrote back, in letters carved into bowls or left beside tombs, asking for justice or forgiveness. To them, memory was immortality, and in their world, nothing was more sacred. In Duat, time did not flow linearly. It bent, folded, returned. The dead passed through lakes of fire and islands of cool shade. They met gods both kind and monstrous. The serpent Mihen coiled protectively around Ra's boat, while the Lake of Knives tested the soul's endurance. Osiris, once dismembered by his brother Set and reassembled by love and magic, ruled not with terror, but with measured silence. He did not punish capriciously, he listened. And when the soul passed all tests, it was reborn. Some believed it could return to Earth as an ache, a radiant spirit, appearing in dreams or as light in the sky. Others hoped simply to rest in the field of reeds, among lotus blossoms and sacred ponds. What is most remarkable is how much care they took for this journey, not only for kings and nobles, but for everyone. Even the poor scraped together money for amulets, spells, or shared tombs. It was not wealth, but preparation, devotion, and purity of heart that mattered. And so the dead walked eternally not as shadows or memories, but as pilgrims on a path made of stars and silence. They walked through Duat each night, through caverns and gates, through tests and flame, and they emerged with the sun, reborn in the east, carried on the golden boat of Ra. In the next chapter, we'll journey back to the living to understand their myths, their gods, their rituals, and how they saw the world itself as a place shaped by divine hands. But for now, let the stars of Duat swirl overhead. Let the feather of Ma'at fall gently through your thoughts, and let the hush of eternity carry you deeper into sleep. In the vast silence of the desert, beneath skies that shimmered with eternity, the ancient Egyptians lifted their eyes not just in wonder but in recognition. For above them stretched not emptiness but a kingdom of gods, of divine order, of stories inscribed in stars and sun, in moon and wind. To live in ancient Egypt was to live in a sacred world, one pulsing with divine presence. Everything had meaning. Every breeze, every shadow, every river current was a whisper from the gods. Their pantheon was not cold or distant. It was intimate, woven into daily life. There were hundreds of deities, some majestic, others humble, some terrifying, others gentle. Each had domains, duties, symbols, and temples. And above all stood a vision of balance, of Ma'at, the cosmic order that kept chaos at bay and bound heaven to earth. Ra, the sun god, was among the greatest. He sailed across the sky each day in a golden boat, casting light and life upon the land. But when night fell, Ra entered Duat, the underworld, where he battled the serpent Apophis, embodiment of chaos and uncreation. This nightly struggle ensured that the sun would rise again, that life would continue. The Egyptians did not take dawn for granted. It was a victory. Ra's boat was often accompanied by other gods, Sia, representing perception, Heka, representing magic, and Hu, representing authoritative speech. These were not abstract concepts, but real forces. When priests spoke prayers, they invoked Hu. When a doctor prepared a remedy, they invoked Heka. When a scribe wrote, they honored Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing, who recorded every deed, measured time, and served as divine arbitrator in disputes. It was Thoth who helped Isis resurrect Osiris, and Osiris, how beloved he was. Once a living king, he was betrayed by his brother Set, dismembered and cast into the Nile. But Isis, his devoted wife, gathered the pieces, restored his body with magic and mourning, and conceived their son Horus. Osiris then descended to the underworld, where he became its ruler not of torment, but of judgment and rebirth. Horus, the falcon-headed sky god, grew in secret and battled Set to reclaim the throne. Their epic struggle reflected not just a myth, but a cosmic principle, the restoration of rightful order. Kings, when crowned, became Horus. In death, they joined Osiris. Their rule was not only political, it was divine. The throne of Egypt was more than a seat of power. It was a symbol of cosmic harmony. Every pharaoh carried the weight of Ma'at, and each offering to the gods, whether a loaf of bread or a gold shrine, was an attempt to maintain that balance. Then there was Hathor, goddess of love, music, and joy, often depicted as a cow or a woman with cow ears and a sun disk between horns. She welcomed the dead into the next life with song and affection. In the temples of Dendera, her face smiled from pillars, tender and timeless. Bastet, the cat goddess, was both protector and bringer of joy. She warded off disease and malevolent spirits. In her honor, cats were pampered, adorned with jewelry, and mummified when they died. Sekhmet, her more wrathful counterpart, was lion-headed and associated with plague and war. It was said that when she unleashed her fury, only trickery and beer dyed red like blood could calm her. Anubis, jackal-headed, presided over embalming and funerary rites. He guided souls, ensured the integrity of the body, and was invoked at every stage of burial. In tombs, his image stood watchful and solemn, painted in deep black, the color of rebirth. Nut, the sky goddess, arched across the heavens, her body sprinkled with stars. Each night, she swallowed Ra, and each morning she gave birth to him again. Her brother Geb, the earth god, lay beneath her, green-skinned and fertile. Their eternal separation was enforced by Shu, the god of air, who held Nut above Geb with outstretched arms. The space between sky and earth, between Nut and Geb, was where humans lived. And so, life was seen as a gift, sustained by divine effort, a fragile space where gods worked endlessly to preserve balance. Temples were not just places of worship, they were engines of cosmic stability. In their inner sanctums, priests performed daily rituals to awaken statues of the gods, bathing them, clothing them, offering food and incense. These acts weren't symbolic, they were essential. Without them, the gods might withdraw, the universe might unravel. Myth was not fiction, it was structure. Stories of divine birth, conflict, triumph, and reconciliation were not bedtime tales. They were the blueprint of existence. Children learned them alongside numbers and hieroglyphs. Farmers understood the flooding of the Nile as the tears of Isis for Osiris. The desert winds were seen as the breath of Set, still jealous, still raging. The stars were souls of the justified dead, sailing with Ra in his eternal voyage. Every field had a spirit, every riverbank held memory. Magic, or Heka, was not superstition. It was a divine force, granted by the creator Atum at the moment of creation. Everyone had access to it. Midwives, priests, shepherds, each could speak words of power, wear protective amulets, or draw sacred symbols to guard their homes. Life was charged with holiness. Nothing was mundane. Even a scarab beetle rolling its ball of dung was sacred. It symbolized Khepri, the morning aspect of the sun god, pushing the solar disk into the sky. In royal tombs, scenes of the god Ptah, creator of all by thought and word, were inscribed with reverence. He was the silent architect, the divine craftsman. Memphis, his city, was a center of artistic mastery. Then there was Amun, who rose from local god to king of gods during the New Kingdom. Blended with Ra as Amun-Ra, he became a symbol of divine mystery, hidden yet present in all things. His temple at Karnak was the largest religious structure ever built, a forest of stone columns reaching toward the heavens. The Egyptians believed that speaking the name of a god invoked their presence, so names were sacred. To erase a name was to condemn a soul to oblivion. To carve a name into a temple was to anchor it to eternity. This reverence extended to kings, to ancestors, and even to enemies. To speak was to shape. To remember was to renew, and so their world was never silent. It hummed with names, with prayers, with stories that circled like the stars. Each myth was a mirror, each god a guide, and each person, whether farmer or pharaoh, lived within this divine story, not as an outsider but as a participant. As the night deepens and the wind stills, let your thoughts drift among the gods. Let Ra's light warm your dreams, let Thoth's wisdom soothe your mind, and let the gentle voice of Hathor sing you softly into the arms of sleep. In the sacred hush of morning, as the first light kissed the limestone temples and the cool of night retreated across the Nile's surface, the priests of ancient Egypt awoke not as ordinary men, but as keepers of the divine rhythm. Their role was not simply ceremonial, it was cosmological. They were the intermediaries between heaven and earth, tasked not only with worship but with maintaining the very balance of the universe. The gods did not merely exist in statues or temples. They were present in the rituals, in the breath of every chant, in the soft plumes of incense rising toward the heavens. Each temple was a cosmos in miniature, a sacred model of the universe, and every act within it was a reenactment of creation. Entering the temple required purity. Priests bathed several times a day, shaved all hair from their bodies, and wore only the finest linen. They abstained from certain foods and sexual relations to maintain ritual cleanliness. Before stepping into the inner sanctum, they rinsed their mouths with natron, cleansed their hands with sacred water, and sometimes recited protective spells. The day began with the awakening of the god's statue, a ritual that took place behind closed doors, in a chamber where only the highest-ranking priest could enter. There, the statue, seen not as a mere carving but as a living manifestation of the deity, was washed, anointed with oils, clothed in fresh linens, and adorned with jewelry. Offerings of bread, beer, meat, and fruit were laid before it. Hymns were sung, incantations whispered, The air thickened with myrrh and frankincense. And then, as the day moved on, the statue was placed back into its shrine, hidden once more from mortal eyes. To the Egyptians, the gods were not passive observers. They needed nourishment, music, companionship, and care. These rituals were not optional. They sustained the divine order. If neglected, the gods might withdraw their protection. Crops might fail. Chaos might creep in from the edges of the world. The temple was divided into increasingly sacred zones. The outer courtyard welcomed the public during festivals. The hypostyle hall, with its towering columns carved in the likeness of papyrus and lotus, represented the primeval swamp from which creation sprang. Deeper within lay the sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, where the god resided. Only priests could pass these thresholds. But on feast days, the gods emerged. Carried in golden barks on the shoulders of men, statues of deities left their sanctuaries and paraded through the streets. Flanked by dancers, musicians, and clouds of incense, the people rejoiced. Offerings were piled high. Drums beat in rhythm with joy. These processions reaffirmed the bond between gods and mortals. Among the most important festivals was the Opet festival in Thebes. During this celebration, the god Amun, accompanied by his consort Mut and their son Khonsu, traveled from the Karnak temple to the Luxor temple. It was a journey of renewal, of divine union. The procession moved along the avenue of sphinxes or sailed on the Nile, cheered by the multitudes. It was a reminder that the gods walked among the people. In Memphis, Ptah was honored with solemn grandeur. In Edfu, Horus was celebrated with reenactments of his battles against Set. In Abydos, the mysteries of Osiris were performed in secret dramas of death, dismemberment, mourning, and rebirth. These rites were not only spiritual but social, bonding communities through shared myth and participation. Priests were scholars. They studied astronomy, medicine, mathematics, and theology. They interpreted dreams, compiled calendars, and recorded omens. Their libraries contained scrolls of spells, hymns, medical papyri, and administrative texts. At Heliopolis, priests observed the movement of stars and planets, aligning temples with celestial events. At Saqqara, they preserved the rites of embalming and mummification, ensuring the safe passage of souls. Within the House of Life per Ankh, they trained apprentices, preserved ancient knowledge, and copied texts with meticulous care. Temples were economic hubs. They owned land, employed workers, bred livestock, and managed granaries. Offerings to the gods were redistributed to the temple staff and the needy. In times of famine, the temple's stores became lifelines. Architecture itself was symbolic. Columns were stylized plants. Ceilings painted with stars. Walls inscribed with cosmic battles and divine lineage. Every surface was a canvas of myth. Every corner whispered stories. In Luxor, inscriptions spoke of the divine birth of pharaohs, their right to rule, their connection to Amun. At Dendera, astronomical ceilings charted the heavens, reflecting the eternal dance above. Even silence was sacred. Certain spells were spoken in hushed tones, their power too great for casual utterance. The names of gods, when written, shimmered with life. Hieroglyphs were not mere letters, they were beings. To inscribe was to create. To erase was to destroy. Amulets were worn for protection. Scarabs, ankhs, eyes of Horus. Each carved with intent. Each empowered through ritual. They were not trinkets, but vessels of divine force. Magic or Heka flowed through all things. Priests used it to heal the sick, bless crops, banish spirits, and ensure fertility. Words, when spoken with knowledge and intent, could bend reality. The Book of the Dead, more accurately. The Book of Coming Forth by Day was a collection of spells to navigate the afterlife. It taught the soul how to avoid traps, answer the gods, cross lakes of fire, and stand before Osiris. Every priest knew these rites. Every tomb echoed with them. Rituals extended beyond death. Mummification was an act of devotion. The body was washed, purified, dried with natron, and wrapped in linen. each organ placed in canopic jars, each step accompanied by prayer. Anubis watched. Priests wore his mask, guiding the soul toward eternity. Funerary texts adorned tomb walls. Ushabti figurines, servants for the afterlife, were buried alongside. The tomb became a home, a portal, a promise. Even the pharaoh, divine in life, needed these rituals in death. The pyramid texts, coffin texts, and later the Amduat and Book of Gates mapped the soul's journey. They were not written for entertainment, but for salvation, for ensuring the eternal sunrise. To the modern mind, this may seem distant, but in Egypt, religion was not a part of life, it was life. Every sunrise was a miracle, every temple a heartbeat, every ritual a cosmic alignment. And the priests, in their devotion, in their silence, in their steps across sandstone floors, held the world together with breath and intention. As the stars rise once more above the Nile, and the stone temples sleep in moonlight, let your own breath slow. Imagine the rustle of linen, the scent of incense, the sacred stillness of dawn. You are not alone. The gods are near. The chants continue, and the eternal story unfolds once more. In the heart of ancient Egypt, where the desert winds whispered secrets through the reeds and the moonlight shimmered across the black waters of the Nile, there existed an invisible world more powerful than kings and more enduring than stone. This was the domain of Heka magic, not as fantasy or illusion, but as a foundational force of the cosmos. The Egyptians believed that Heka was the energy the gods used to create the world, the substance from which existence itself was woven. Every prayer, every amulet, every sacred word was an invocation of this power. And the priests were not simply holy men, they were magicians, scholars of the sacred science, protectors of the realm between the seen and the unseen. In the temples and libraries, within scrolls inked in black and red, knowledge of Heka was recorded and preserved. Some texts were known only to the highest-ranking priests, hidden in stone chambers sealed with curses. The magic of Egypt was not chaotic, it was ritualized, precise, and deeply intertwined with language. Words held power not because they symbolized meaning, but because they were believed to embody it. To name something was to summon its essence. To speak a spell was to set reality in motion. This was why names were treated with reverence. The name of a pharaoh, enclosed in a cartouche, was not mere decoration, it was a magical safeguard. To erase a name was to erase a soul from eternity. To write one was to anchor it in the world forever. Magic permeated every aspect of life. Farmers would bury amulets in their fields to ensure fertility. Mothers hung protective charms near cradles to ward off malevolent spirits. Travelers carried sacred texts tucked into belts or sewn into tunics, hoping to avoid scorpion stings and serpent bites. Even physicians were trained in magical incantations, often blending medical treatment with spiritual protections. Disease was not only physical, it could be the work of a demon, a curse, or a wandering ghost. A priest-physician might administer herbs while reciting spells from the Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical texts in history, filled with rituals, remedies, and magical prescriptions. There were spells to prevent nightmares, to induce love, to bring rain, to silence an enemy, or to ensure victory in court. Magical dolls, wax figures representing adversaries, were created and ritually destroyed, bound, burned, or buried as acts of symbolic domination. These were not mere superstitions. They were believed to alter reality, to influence fate. Heka was seen as morally neutral, it could be used for good or ill. Protection was its most common purpose. The Eye of Horus, the Ankh, the Scarab all were charged with protective power. One of the most powerful texts was the Book of the Dead, a compilation of spells designed to guide the soul through the afterlife, past demons, traps, and divine judgments. Each copy was personalized for the deceased, with their name inserted into the spells, ensuring they could speak the correct words at each gate of the underworld. The dead required magic just as the living did. Tomb walls were inscribed with protective formulas. Coffins bore spells of light and life. Mummies were wrapped with amulets, small figures of gods, inscribed gems, sacred texts on papyrus, all carefully placed according to ritual maps of the body. One of the most important of these was the heart scarab, which would speak in defense of the deceased during the weighing of the heart ceremony before Osiris. If the heart was lighter than the feather of Ma'at, the soul would pass on. If not, it would be devoured by Ammit, the soul eater. In some temples, particularly in Heliopolis and Hermopolis, priests practiced astral magic. They studied the stars and planets, believing celestial events reflected divine will. Temples were aligned with solstices and star risings, most famously the heliacal rising of Sirius, which heralded the annual flooding of the Nile and the Egyptian New Year. The Dendera zodiac, a celestial map carved into the ceiling of the Hathor temple, captured this cosmic knowledge in stone. The belief in transformation in disguise was also central. Gods often took the forms of animals: falcons, jackals, lions, cats, not as metaphor, but as manifestation. Priests wore masks during rituals, embodying these divine forms. The mask of Anubis, for example, was worn during embalming rites, transforming the priest into the god of the dead. This wasn't theater, it was invocation. The divine could be summoned, drawn into the world through symbols, rituals, and voice. One of the most mysterious practices was dream incubation. In certain temples, supplicants would sleep overnight in sacred chambers, hoping to receive messages from gods through dreams. These dreams were interpreted by priests skilled in dream magic, often recorded in dream books that listed common symbols and their meanings. Water was also magical. Sacred lakes in temple precincts were used for purification and scrying. Priests would gaze into the water's surface or into polished bowls of obsidian, seeking visions. In the darkness, reflections shimmered and moved, revealing omens, answers, or the presence of divine forces. Music and sound were integral to magic. The sistrum, a rattle-like instrument sacred to Hathor, was used in temple ceremonies to summon gods or banish evil. Chants were composed with mathematical precision, their rhythm and pitch believed to align with cosmic frequencies. Even silence was a form of magic, a space in which power gathered, waiting to be shaped. In the private realm, love spells were common. These were often inscribed on pottery or papyrus, invoking deities like Isis or Bes. Some included instructions for making perfumes, concoctions, or amulets. Others were darker binding spells meant to compel affection or punish betrayal. Sorcery, in its darker form, was feared. Accusations of harmful magic could result in trials, exile, or execution. But even the state used such power. Protective spells were etched into fortress walls, palace gates, and weapons. In times of crisis, pharaohs would commission large-scale rituals involving thousands driving demons from cities, purifying the land, and reaffirming cosmic order. In one of the most intriguing magical texts, the Metternich Stela, we find the legend of Isis reviving her son Horus after he was stung by a scorpion. The spell includes detailed invocations, names of scorpions, and commands spoken by the goddess. Such texts were copied by healers and kept in homes for protection. These spells are windows into a world where myth and medicine, science and spirit, breath and eternity were bound together. Even in modern times, archaeologists have uncovered curses placed at tomb entrances, warnings to grave robbers and desecrators. While modern minds may dismiss them as superstition, the ancients believed these words had power, anchored in Heka, resonating with divine authority. Egyptian magic was not a fringe belief. It was the very scaffold of life. From the moment of birth to the passage into death, every milestone, every danger, every joy was surrounded by ritual, protected by spells, enhanced by sacred symbols. The gods were close. The unseen world shimmered just beneath the surface. And those who knew the words, who held the proper amulet, who walked in alignment with the divine order, could reach through the veil and shape their destiny. Now, as you lie still and quiet, feel that ancient current of Heka flowing through time. Let it wrap around you like linen, soft and eternal. Imagine the flicker of oil lamps, the scent of frankincense, The hush of stone chambers. The priests are chanting. The stars align above. And the magic that built the pyramids, that bound gods and men, is still whispering just beyond the veil. In the everyday rhythm of ancient Egypt, beneath the towering temples and beyond the gaze of pharaohs and priests, life unfolded in patterns of sun and river, labor and rest, joy and silence. While the grand narratives of gods and kings captured eternity in stone, it was in the quiet corners of homes, the shaded alleys of villages, and the open fields along the Nile where the true essence of Egyptian civilization breathed. Here, the people rose with the light and rested with the stars, their days woven around the cycle of the Nile and the demands of the land. Birth was the first threshold. In small mud brick houses, a woman in labor would be surrounded by female relatives and midwives, often invoking Taret, the goddess with the body of a hippopotamus and the limbs of a lioness, who protected women in childbirth. Amulets of Bes, the dwarf god with fierce eyes and wild hair, were hung nearby to scare away evil spirits. The birth was not only a physical act, it was a spiritual crossing, and its rituals reflected a blend of fear, faith, and hope. Infants were anointed with oils, swaddled and closely guarded. Disease was always near, and so protective spells were whispered over cribs, and charms were tied to tiny wrists. Children who survived their fragile early years grew into a world of order. Boys were introduced early to the skills of their fathers, farming, fishing, stone-cutting, or scribing, while girls learned the domestic arts of weaving, grinding grain, managing households, and often serving as the spiritual heart of the home. The Egyptian house was simple, flat-roofed, made of sun-dried mud bricks, often just 2 or 3 rooms centered around a courtyard. In this modest space, daily life played out with quiet repetition. The family rose before dawn, when the desert air was still cool. Bread dough was prepared and baked in clay ovens. Water was fetched from communal wells or directly from the river. The meal, usually beer, bread, onions, lentils, or dried fish, was shared on mats, eaten with fingers, often in silence. Beer, thick and nutritious, was the staple drink for all ages. It was brewed from partially baked loaves of barley bread and stored in tall ceramic jars. The taste was earthy and sour, but it nourished and comforted. Wine existed, but it was expensive and reserved mostly for the upper class or for ritual offerings. Clothing was light and practical. Men wore linen kilts or tunics, women wore sheath dresses with broad straps. The linen, spun from flax, was sometimes bleached to a near-white brightness, especially among the wealthier citizens. Jewelry bracelets, beaded necklaces, amulets was common, not only as decoration but as protection. Kohl lined the eyes of men and women alike, not just for beauty, but to reduce sun glare and repel infections. Time was not measured by clocks, but by the sun and the tasks of the day. Work began early. Farmers tended to fields using simple plows pulled by oxen, wooden hoes, sickles. Laborers hauled stones, built granaries, or carved tombs. Artisans painted, sculpted, or wove. In towns, scribes sat cross-legged in courtyards, transcribing legal documents, letters, or prayers. The scribe's reed brush was a symbol of literacy and status, for to write was to possess a kind of magic. In the afternoon heat, labor paused. Workers rested in the shade, or napped, or gathered for shared meals. Children played with clay dolls, balls, or carved animals. Adults sometimes played Senet, a board game with deep spiritual significance, symbolizing the soul's journey through the underworld. Domestic life was communal. Neighbors knew one another. News spread through markets and temple courtyards. Gossip and storytelling were common. Music drifted from homes, harps, flutes, tambourines, accompanying moments of joy or ritual. Weddings were simple and rarely marked by large public ceremonies. A man and woman became husband and wife by mutual agreement and often moved in together immediately. The relationship was expected to be faithful and enduring. Love poems found on ancient papyri express deep affection, longing, and tenderness, reminders that across millennia, the human heart remains familiar. Women held a unique position in Egyptian society. They could own property, initiate divorce, and run businesses. While patriarchal structures existed, women's legal rights were surprisingly advanced for the time. Many acted as priestesses, scribes, or healers. Some even held titles like Chantress of Amun, presiding over musical rites in temples. Religious life permeated the domestic sphere. Small household shrines were common niches with offerings, images of protective deities, or incense burners. Festivals punctuated the calendar, many of them tied to agricultural cycles. During Opet, statues of Amun, Mut, and Khonsu were paraded from Karnak to Luxor in grand processions. But even far from Thebes, families celebrated with music, food, and prayer. Life was not without hardship. Disease, famine, floods, and accidents were constant threats. Yet even suffering was framed within a cosmic order. Misfortune was sometimes seen as imbalance with Ma'at, the principle of truth, balance, and harmony. To live well was to live in accordance with Ma'at, not just morally, but ritually and socially. Funerary customs reflected the belief in continuity. Death was not an end, but a transition. Ordinary citizens could not afford grand tombs, but many saved for modest burials. Mummification was expensive, so most were buried in simple graves, perhaps wrapped in linens, perhaps with shabti figurines to serve them in the afterlife. The poor might be buried with nothing but a few pots and amulets, yet even these humble graves were often marked with prayers, offerings, or inscriptions. The family would return to tend the tomb, pour libations, speak the name of the departed, and keep their memory alive. For the Egyptians, memory itself was a form of immortality. To be forgotten was to truly die. Across the Nile, in the necropolis, the tombs of artisans at Deir el-Medina reveal a microcosm of this worldview. These workers, who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, lived in a planned village with its own laws, religious practices, and unique social dynamic. They left behind personal letters, graffiti, and art that show love, jealousy, humor, and sorrow, glimpses of lives lived fully under the gaze of eternity. Education was rare but not absent. Boys from wealthy families might attend scribal schools, memorizing hieroglyphs, math, legal codes, and ritual texts. Lessons were strict, often involving corporal punishment. Yet a literate man could rise in status, working in administration, temples, or as a tax collector. Justice was administered locally. Village elders or officials heard disputes. There were no lawyers. People represented themselves. Oaths were sworn before gods. Punishments varied: fines, beatings, exile, or worse. Yet fairness was an ideal, tied again to Ma'at. The seasons governed everything. The inundation, Akhet, flooded the fields with nutrient-rich silt. During Pare, crops were planted and grew. In Shemu, the harvest was gathered. This rhythm shaped every ritual, every plan. The Nile gave and took, its flooding both feared and revered. At night, homes were lit by oil lamps. Families told stories, sang, or prayed. They gazed at the stars, naming constellations like the ship, the hippo, or the bull's foreleg. These celestial patterns were not distant, they were divine. The soul of Osiris, they believed, shimmered among them. The people of ancient Egypt did not separate the sacred from the mundane. Each act, from baking bread to naming a child, carried meaning. Their world was enchanted, ordered, alive with presence. Even now, as you listen in the stillness, you can almost hear the rustle of papyrus, the call of geese at dawn, the soft lapping of water at the edge of a reed boat. Their lives were brief, often difficult, but rooted in awe. In every sunrise, they saw the rebirth of Ra. In every shadow, the patience of Osiris. In every gesture of kindness, the echo of Ma'at. They are long gone, but their breath lingers in the dust, their prayers still etched in stone, their wisdom drifting gently on the wind. The ancient Egyptians approached beauty, grooming, and personal presentation not as superficial pursuits, but as expressions of cosmic harmony and spiritual alignment. In their view, Cleanliness was not only pleasing to the senses but sacred, a reflection of one's internal order and devotion to Maat. Thus, even in modest homes, daily routines often began with washing using water drawn from the Nile or wells, sometimes mixed with natron, a naturally occurring salt used as soap. Both men and women would cleanse their hands, faces, and feet, mindful of the dust that clung to skin in a desert world. Scent was essential. Perfumed oils were applied to the body not only for fragrance but to protect the skin from the drying sun. Ointments made from myrrh, frankincense, cinnamon, and lotus were common. The wealthy might have servants who prepared elaborate concoctions, while ordinary folk relied on simpler balms. Perfume cones made of scented wax were worn on the head during banquets, slowly melting and releasing fragrance as the evening progressed. Hair was carefully maintained. Children often had their heads shaved to avoid lice, except for a sidelock of youth, a tuft that marked them as protected by deities. Adults varied. Women typically wore their hair long, sometimes braided or adorned with beads, while men kept theirs shorter. Wigs were popular, crafted from human hair or plant fibers, curled or styled according to fashion. Priests and high officials shaved their heads and bodies completely as a symbol of ritual purity. Body hair was generally removed, especially among the elite, using bronze razors or pumice stones. Eyebrows were shaped, armpits cleaned, and faces kept smooth. To be unkempt was not only undesirable, it was unholy. Cosmetics were more than decoration. Kohl was used to line the eyes, believed to ward off evil spirits and reduce glare from the sun. Green malachite and black galena powders were stored in small jars and applied with reed brushes. Red ochre tinted the lips and cheeks. Even men used these tools, especially those in court or religious service. Mirrors, made of polished copper or bronze, were prized possessions, often with handles shaped like the goddess Hathor or floral stems. Dressing was a deliberate ritual. Linen garments were bleached and sometimes starched to hold shape. While basic clothing was simple, the cut and translucency varied with status and occasion. Wealthy women wore pleated dresses with broad collars of faience or gold beads, while men in service to the pharaoh might wear finely tailored kilts with sashes and ornate belts. Jewelry was ubiquitous. Not merely ornament, it served as amulet, status symbol, and spiritual talisman. Scarabs, ankhs, eyes of Horus, and cartouches were carved into gold, silver, and colored stones. Children wore protective charms strung around their necks or waists. Rings, earrings, bracelets, and anklets jingled softly with movement. Color had meaning. Blue evoked the heavens and the Nile. Green symbolized fertility and renewal. Red stood for power and vitality. To wear certain stones or hues was to invoke divine attributes. The concept of beauty extended beyond the physical. A beautiful soul, described in texts as true of voice or justified, was one who lived in accordance with truth, generosity, and reverence. This harmony was considered more lasting than any outward feature, yet outward beauty was still honored. In love poetry, lovers compared each other's eyes to lotus petals, lips to wine, voices to birdsong. Paintings often exaggerated ideal forms, slender limbs, high cheekbones, wide eyes. These were not attempts at realism, but at idealized essence. Aging was accepted but managed with care. Elderly men and women continued grooming rituals, using oils to soften wrinkles, herbs to darken gray hair, and poultices to soothe aching joints. While youth was praised, age brought wisdom and honor. Elders often presided over family decisions, mediating disputes and recounting ancestral tales. Medicine and hygiene were closely linked. Doctors prescribed regimens of diet, cleanliness, and ritual. Remedies for bad breath included chewing natron or aromatic herbs. Dental hygiene, though limited, involved twigs, rinses, and pastes. Despite such care, tooth decay was rampant due to grit and bread and lack of refined techniques. Women's roles in health and beauty were expansive. They were midwives, healers, perfumers. Recipes for creams and treatments have survived, written on papyri or carved into temple walls. detailing ingredients like honey, milk, salt, and crushed stones. Bathing in milk and honey was believed to preserve youth. Henna was used to dye nails and hair, and to paint hands and feet during celebrations. Intimacy and sexuality were treated with openness and reverence. Erotic texts, fertility statues, and love songs testify to a culture that embraced pleasure within bounds of ma'at. While fidelity in marriage was ideal, some tolerance existed for polygamy among the elite and concubinage in royal harems. Yet affection and emotional connection were central. Letters between spouses speak of longing, partnership, and deep trust. Even in death, beauty was preserved. The embalming process involved removing organs, desiccating the body, and anointing it with oils. False eyes might be inserted, hair arranged, and the skin darkened with resin. The goal was to make the deceased whole and recognizable in the afterlife. Coffins were decorated with spells and images, but also with personal details favored jewelry, beauty marks, or tattoos. The ideal afterlife was one in which the deceased appeared eternally young and perfect, working fields under gentle sun, surrounded by loved ones. Banquets and celebrations displayed beauty in motion. Guests arrived in their finest, attended by servants who offered scented flowers, drinks, and delicacies. Dancers with elaborate braids and sheer garments performed to the rhythm of drums and flutes. Singers praised the gods, the host, and the joys of life. In these moments, the Egyptians glimpsed eternity in pleasure, harmony, and style. Tattoos were not widespread, but existed. Dancers, priestesses, and some healers bore patterned dots, lines, symbols believed to enhance fertility or mark devotion. Piercings were rare beyond the ears, but occasionally seen in nose or navel. These were not trends, but spiritual declarations. Clothing adapted to season and role. During festivals, priests wore elaborate headdresses, leopard skins, or colored sashes. Farmers in harvest might strip to loincloths. Children often ran naked until puberty, their skin protected by oils. Nudity was not shameful but practical, sometimes sacred. The body was not hidden, it was honored. Etiquette reinforced ideals of grace. One bowed to elders, avoided direct eye contact with superiors, and spoke softly in temples. Cleanliness extended to speech. Words were to be measured, respectful, uplifting. Gossip was discouraged, but poetry was prized. Even in common life, elegance of form and expression was cultivated. Beauty competitions were held among young women during festivals to Hathor, goddess of love and music. Winners were crowned with lotus garlands and serenaded with harps. These were not vain displays, but affirmations of joy and fertility. Visual art reflected these ideals. Wall paintings depicted daily scenes: bathing, dressing, embracing, rendered with care and symmetry. Even in humor, the Egyptians celebrated form. Clay figurines with exaggerated features, comedic scrolls with caricatures. Yet beneath the playfulness lay a deep respect for aesthetics. To beautify oneself was to honor the gods. To maintain the home was to mirror divine order. To adorn the body was to shield the soul. In a land where death stood always nearby, beauty offered comfort, defiance, and connection. As you rest now, imagine the coolness of a perfumed cloth on your forehead, the soft chime of gold bangles, the whisper of linen against skin. Picture yourself beneath a starry canopy, surrounded by incense, laughter, and glowing oil lamps. This was the heart of Egypt's daily magic, a world where every act, however small, was a step toward the eternal. In ancient Egypt, death was not feared as a conclusion, but anticipated as a continuation. It was not the end, but a crossing, not a void, but a journey into eternity, where the soul would live on if properly prepared. This preparation began not at the threshold of old age, but in youth. For every act of cleanliness, every offering, every virtue cultivated in daily life was a step toward eternal harmony in the afterlife. The Egyptians viewed aging as a natural, even honored phase of existence. Wrinkles and frailty were signs not of decay, but of experience and divine favor. Elders were treated with respect, consulted in matters of family and tradition, and given roles in ritual life when possible. But they also lived with the awareness that their time in this realm would end and that readiness was essential. Mummification was at the heart of this readiness, not simply as a method of preservation, but as a sacred rite of transformation. The body, believed to house the soul, or ka, needed to remain recognizable so the spirit could return to it. The process began within hours of death. The embalmer's priests trained in secret rituals washed the body with Nile water and palm wine. An incision was made in the left side, through which the internal organs were removed. Each organ was preserved in separate canopic jars, each guarded by a protective deity: the stomach by Duamudef, the intestines by Kebasenuef, the lungs by Hapi, and the liver by Imseti. The brain, oddly, was removed through the nostrils and discarded, while the heart, considered the seat of emotion and memory, was often left in place or embalmed separately. The body was packed with natron, a salt that drew out moisture, and left to dry for 40 days. Afterward, it was anointed with oils and resins, frankincense, myrrh, cedar intended to purify and protect. Layers of linen bandages were wrapped around limbs, torso, and head, often with amulets tucked between the layers, scarabs for rebirth, eyes of Horus for protection, and ankhs for life. Spells from the Book of the Dead might be written on the wrappings, or tucked in scrolls within the layers. The face was masked, sometimes with painted linen, sometimes with gold designed to show the person not as they were in death, but as they should be in eternity. A priest wearing the mask of Anubis performed the opening of the mouth ceremony, touching the mummy's lips with ritual tools to restore the senses: sight, speech, breath. This act was believed to animate the soul, preparing it for the afterlife. Funerals varied by wealth. The poor might be buried in simple pits or communal tombs, with basic provisions and a few charms. The middle class arranged modest tombs, with painted walls, personal belongings, and offerings of food and drink. The elite spared no expense. Tombs were architectural testaments to the deceased's life and hopes, chambers for offerings, false doors through which spirits could pass, and elaborate reliefs depicting idealized scenes of labor, feasting, and divine communion. Burial goods were essential. Shabta's small figurines were included to serve the dead in the afterlife, performing tasks so the soul could rest. Furniture, tools, cosmetics, clothing, and even pets were sometimes buried alongside. In royal tombs, the bounty was immense. Gold, wells, chariots, statues. But what mattered most was not wealth, but spiritual preparedness. Death in Egypt was a gateway to judgment. The soul, or Ba, would journey to the Hall of Two Truths, where it faced Osiris and 42 judges. The heart was weighed against the feather of Ma'at. If balanced, the soul passed into the field of reeds, a perfect mirror of earthly life, but without sorrow, hunger, or toil. If heavier, it was devoured by Amit, the soul eater, and ceased to exist. To guide this perilous journey, the deceased relied on magic and memory. The Book of the Dead, a collection of hymns, spells, and incantations, offered maps and passwords, detailing how to address each deity, how to pass gates, and how to speak truthfully. Even in common tombs, versions of this book, written on papyrus or painted on walls, accompanied the dead. The afterlife was not abstract, it was vivid. There were fields to plow, rivers to cross, banquets to enjoy, loved ones reunited. Gods walked among souls. Time was circular, eternal. And though elaborate, this vision was egalitarian. All Egyptians, regardless of birth, could attain it, provided they lived with Ma'at and were properly buried. Grief was not hidden. Mourners wailed, tore their garments, and dusted their heads with ash. Women often led lamentations, especially hired professional mourners who expressed sorrow with poetic intensity. Rituals of mourning included days of offerings, purification, and remembrance. Annual festivals, like the Feast of the Valley, invited the dead to return, share meals, and bask in the company of descendants. Tombs were not sealed and forgotten, they were visited, maintained, honored. Death became a relationship, not a break. Artifacts show that even children understood these rites. Small coffins, toys buried with infants, and child-sized mummies speak of a culture that faced mortality with tenderness and ceremony. To die young was a tragedy, but to die unprepared was worse. That is why even modest homes kept charms, made offerings, and lived mindfully. Every home was a temple, every act a prayer, every breath a step toward the stars. In times of plague or famine, these beliefs were tested. Tombs filled quickly, and embalming was rushed or abandoned. But still, rituals endured. Even a hastily wrapped corpse, if given a name and a word of love, had hope. Because the Egyptians believed in memory. To speak a name was to sustain a soul. To forget was to erase. That is why their stories, even now, echo across millennia. That is why you, tonight, have heard their breath in the desert wind. Sleep now in the silence of tombs undisturbed. Imagine the flicker of oil lamps, the scent of resin, the chant of a priest calling a soul to rise. Picture yourself among golden coffins and painted walls, where time holds still and peace waits eternal. In that stillness, the dead are not gone. They are simply waiting. For mourning, for memory, for you. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was not merely a king. He was the living embodiment of divine order, the human manifestation of Horus, the falcon-headed god, and the son of Ra, the sun god. His presence was not just a political convenience, it was essential to the cosmic balance of Ma'at, the principle of truth, harmony, and justice that kept the universe from unraveling into chaos. To be pharaoh was to carry not only the weight of a nation, but the balance of the cosmos itself. From the moment of coronation, the pharaoh became semi-divine. His titles, numbering often in the dozens, reflected his sacred role: Lord of the Two Lands, the Son of the Sun, the Strong Bull, the Uniter of Upper and Lower Egypt. Each title was steeped in symbolism and reaffirmed his role as a bridge between gods and mortals. The act of coronation was itself a ritual layered in myth. The new ruler would be adorned with the double crown, the white headjet of Upper Egypt, and the red deshret of Lower Egypt, symbolizing unity. The sacred crook and flail were placed in his hands to show shepherd-like guidance in punishment. He would be led into the temple sanctuaries, introduced to the gods not as a stranger, but as a brother returning to his rightful place. Living within the palace complex, the pharaoh was surrounded by luxury, but also rigid ritual. His days were not his own. He awoke to priests reciting hymns, was bathed in perfumed water by servants, anointed with sacred oils, and dressed in ceremonial linen. Offerings were made to the gods on his behalf, and he, in turn, performed rites to sustain the land. His diet was rich meat, wine, fruits, honey cakes, but every meal followed custom. Nothing was without symbolism. Even his sandals, sometimes adorned with images of enemies, served as daily reminders of his supremacy. Pharaohs traveled across Egypt in opulent barges with gilded prows and billowing sails, visiting temples, inspecting projects, and displaying their divine presence to the people. When he spoke, scribes transcribed his words as law. When he appeared, crowds prostrated in reverence. Yet this awe was cultivated through performance, through statuary that showed him as youthful and strong even into old age, through wall reliefs depicting victories both real and exaggerated, and through temples where he was shown in eternal communion with the gods. But the pharaoh was not immortal. His mortality posed a paradox. How could a god die? The answer was mythological. Upon death, the pharaoh ceased to be Horus and became Osiris, god of the underworld. His successor then became Horus in turn, completing the cycle. This divine transition was prepared for throughout his reign. Tombs, such as those in the Valley of the Kings, were carved into rock with obsessive care. The walls were painted with vibrant scenes from the Amduat and Book of Gates, guides through the underworld. The pharaoh's journey after death was as heroic as any battle in life. Passing through night hours, confronting serpents and demons, defending his name, and ultimately being reborn with the sun. In his tomb, the pharaoh was laid in nested sarcophagi, the innermost often made of gold, Surrounding him were treasures, chariots, thrones, statues of gods, chests of linen and incense. His heart was protected by magical amulets, his face hidden behind a death mask designed to resemble his perfected, divine form. Priests chanted spells, sealed the tomb, and left offerings that would be renewed during festival days. During life, pharaohs commanded vast building campaigns. Temples to Amun, Ra, Ta, and Hathor rose from desert sands under their command. These temples were not only religious centers but economic engines, employing priests, scribes, artisans, and farmers. The Temple of Karnak, for example, expanded over centuries, but bore the cartouches of many rulers, each asserting their legacy. Pharaohs also commissioned obelisks, giant spires of granite that pierced the sky and caught the sun, symbolizing Ra's power and the pharaoh's eternal connection to it. Every monument, every inscription, every colossal statue served a singular purpose: to ensure the pharaoh would never be forgotten. Memory was immortality. Forgotten pharaohs faded into obscurity, their names chiseled out or lost. But remembered ones lived on in stone, story, and starlight. Some pharaohs were known for military might. Thutmose III expanded Egypt's borders into Nubia and Syria, leading campaigns recorded on temple walls with meticulous detail. Ramses II, called the Great, boasted of his exploits at Kadesh, his monuments outnumbering any other kings. He built cities, temples, and statues so immense that even the winds of time could not erase his face. Others were known for piety and reform. Akhenaten, in a controversial shift, worshipped the Aten, the sun disk above all gods. His art was fluid and human, his reign brief and turbulent, his legacy nearly erased by successors who returned to traditional worship. His queen, Nefertiti, stood as a figure of divine beauty and influence. Then came Tutankhamun, a boy king whose fame owes more to modern discovery than ancient impact. Yet his untouched tomb, discovered in 1922, illuminated a world of ritual splendor and buried secrets. The role of queens was not marginal. Women like Hatshepsut ruled in their own right, donning male regalia, appearing in art as pharaohs, and leaving behind towering monuments. She was not a queen regent, but king herself. Others, like Nefertari and Tiye, wielded immense influence behind the scenes. Royal women were priestesses, political advisors, and bearers of divine bloodlines. The palace was a place of protocol and intrigue. Concubines, scribes, eunuchs, and magicians moved through its halls. Dreams were interpreted, omens recorded, and decisions made that would ripple through centuries. Rebellions were quelled, treaties brokered, and enemies dealt with sometimes through battle, sometimes through curse. The pharaoh's power was total, but not invincible. Famine, flood failure, or foreign invasion could test his image. When the Nile did not rise, the people prayed harder, but they also questioned. Was the pharaoh displeasing the gods? Had Ma'at been disturbed? That is why rituals had to continue, why temples had to pulse with incense and music, why statues had to be repainted, and why the ruler, even weary, stood tall before the altar. As night fell on Egypt, the pharaoh sat in chambers of incense and carved stone, hearing petitions, reviewing scrolls, or simply listening to silence. Around him, the city dimmed, the stars rose, and priests began their nightly chants to guard the realm through darkness. Somewhere beyond the palace, farmers dreamt of rain, builders sharpened tools, and children learned to trace his name on shards of pottery. His image looked down from every wall, his word, etched in granite, whispered across time. And in that hush, beneath layers of gold and silence, he remembered he was only a man, playing a god, guarding a Phra, guile flame against eternity's breath. Sleep now, in the warmth of the sun-baked stone, beneath the gaze of falcons and the hush of reeds. You have walked in the footsteps of kings. Tomorrow, we follow their footsteps deeper still. In the vast machine of ancient Egyptian governance, the pharaoh stood as the golden keystone, but around him, a latticework of officials, priests, Architects, scribes, generals, and foreign emissaries kept the kingdom breathing and thriving. These were not mere attendants, they were guardians of divine order, each one entrusted with maintaining the sacred architecture of society. From the thick papyrus scrolls in administrative buildings to the reverberating chants echoing through temple halls, every cog turned in synchrony with the pulse of the Nile. At the pinnacle of civil service was the vizier, a role of unmatched authority just beneath the pharaoh. Often depicted bowing low in reliefs, the vizier nonetheless controlled the machinery of taxation, justice, trade, and building. He received daily reports, oversaw audits, supervised regional governors, and held open courts for those seeking redress. He was the face of law, and his seal could open gates or close them forever. His mansion, lavish yet rigid, was both administrative hub and moral compass, where balance, fairness, and duty were extolled. The priesthood, meanwhile, governed the invisible. Temples were not only places of worship, but political, economic, and social powerhouses. High priests of Ammon, Ptah, Ra, and Isis controlled vast tracts of land, storehouses, labor forces, and libraries of sacred knowledge. Their robes shimmered with linen bleached in sacred waters, and their voices sang hymns thousands of years old. At dawn, they awakened the gods by unveiling statues hidden deep within sanctuaries, offering incense and perfumed oil, speaking prayers to ensure the sun would rise once more. Within temple walls, astronomers tracked celestial cycles, mathematicians planned festivals, and doctors, often priests themselves, used incantations beside surgical instruments. And yet, within this sanctity, politics brewed. The priesthood's growing wealth, particularly that of Amun's temple in Thebes, sometimes rivaled the pharaoh's own treasury. Diplomacy was an art as complex as any rite. Foreign dignitaries from Nubia, the Levant, or the Hittite Empire brought tribute and requests, arriving at court with gold, exotic animals, incense, lapis lazuli, and even daughters to offer in marriage. Egyptian scribes documented every item meticulously, and interpreters conveyed layers of politeness, threat, or alliance. Treaties were inscribed on stone and sealed with divine oaths. Gifts exchanged were symbols of loyalty or ransom. An alabaster vase, a ceremonial dagger, a captive monkey each held significance beyond its appearance. Architecture was sacred storytelling in stone. Overseen by royal architects and engineers, construction was both a tribute to gods and a projection of Pharaoh's eternal dominion. Grand projects like the temples at Abu Simbel, Luxor, or Karnak demanded coordination across regions. Stone was quarried in Aswan, transported down the Nile, carved with symbols of protection and rebirth. Workers included skilled artisans, not slaves as once popularly believed, but respected laborers who lived in special communities like Deir el-Medina. They worked in teams, rotated shifts, received medical care, and left graffiti testifying to their daily struggles and joys. Military strength supported diplomacy. Generals and soldiers protected borders, escorted trade routes, and quelled uprisings. Campaigns were celebrated in reliefs, enemy kings begging for mercy, rows of captives, carts of spoils. Yet war was also ritualized. Banners depicting gods led the troops, oracles were consulted, and even battles had sacred overtones. Armies returned not only with gold and cattle, but with gods of conquered regions, absorbed into Egypt's pantheon. Behind this external might, internal control depended on scribes, the quiet architects of bureaucracy. From the age of 7 or 8, boys destined for this path endured years of education, learning to master hundreds of hieroglyphs, numbers, geometry, law, and poetic language. Scribes recorded taxes, measured fields, kept time, drafted decrees, copied prayers, and even composed royal propaganda. Their styluses shaped not just language, but the flow of power. Many rose to influential positions, marrying into elite families and even advising pharaohs. Festivals were vital expressions of unity and cosmic renewal. The Opet festival in Thebes was among the grandest. Statues of Amun, Mut, and Khonsu were paraded from Karnak to Luxor in gilded barges amid music, incense, dancing, and cheers. These festivals reminded the people that the gods walked among them, and the pharaoh was their chosen mediator. Commoners glimpsed the sacred as processions wound through streets, scattering lotus petals, offering bread, and burning resin. Music and chanting rose from temple steps as acrobats flipped and flutes trilled in joyous cacophony. Within palaces, courtiers engaged in ceremonial behavior. Dress codes, seating order, greeting rituals all were carefully regulated. A misplaced gesture could offend. Eunuchs carried messages between chambers. Pages fanned nobility with ostrich plumes. Royal children were taught by elite tutors in mathematics, history, ethics, and horsemanship, preparing them to one day assume roles in governance or the priesthood. And always the architecture of fear lingered beneath ceremony. Punishment for treason, theft, or sacrilege was swift and public. Spies listened in markets. Informants whispered to officials. Royal secrets were guarded by both curse and blade. Executions were rare but symbolic, reminding all that divine order had guardians. Foreigners, too, found roles within Egypt's system. Libyans served as guards, Nubians as archers, and Syrians as artisans. While Egypt saw itself as the center of the world, it did not shun useful skills or exotic beauty. Foreign deities found niches in temples, foreign dancers enchanted courts. The divine wheel of Ma'at welcomed balance from beyond. And yet, for all this structure, life at court was never static. Factions formed, alliances shifted. A favored general could fall from grace overnight. A priest's dream might spell doom for a royal project. Dreams mattered. So did omens. The flight of birds, a flickering flame, a drop of oil forming an unexpected shape, each could alter decisions. Pharaohs consulted dream interpreters, sorcerers, and astrologers before major choices. At night, in chambers perfumed with blue lotus and myrrh, high officials lay on linen sheets whispering calculations, prophecies, and ambitions. By torchlight, plans were made that shaped pyramids or toppled dynasties. The heartbeat of Egypt pulsed through these corridors, silent but thunderous. This was not a land of isolated kings, but of networks bound by ritual, duty, and belief. Every name, chiseled into stone, represented a thread in a vast web, connecting heaven and earth. Even the simplest task, measuring floodwaters, delivering grain, repairing a statue, held divine weight. The court was not just a place. It was a performance, a doctrine, a sacred ecosystem. And each participant, from vizier to flute player, from scribe to stablehand, played a role in keeping eternity moving forward. Let your eyes close now, with a scent of cedar and linen in your imagination. Picture the columns rising into starlit skies, the chanting of priests echoing through dusk, the slow dance of light on gold-plated walls. You've seen the gears that turned an empire. Soon we'll descend deeper into its mysteries. In the luxurious world behind palace walls, the life of Egypt's elite unfolded in serene opulence, framed by columns of painted limestone and softened by the perfume of exotic oils. This was not simply a life of privilege, but one built around careful ritual, appearance, and an unspoken competition for grace, refinement, and favor. A noble's day began before the first light of dawn, not with labor but with cleansing. Servants heated water scented with crushed lotus petals and sycamore bark, which they poured into polished alabaster basins. Washing was an act of purity, physical and spiritual. Nobles bathed not to remove grime. There was little of that in these carefully tended households, but to realign themselves with Ma'at, the divine balance of the universe. Afterward, skin was massaged with oils made from moringa, almond, and frankincense. This was no indulgence, it was medicine, protection against the desert's drying breath, and a sign of refinement. Hygiene was sacred. Teeth were cleaned with chewed twigs and salt. Eye makeup, dark kohl drawn in dramatic swoops, was not only for beauty but to ward off infection and the evil eye. Green malachite or powdered lapis lazuli added iridescent brilliance above the lids. Women and men alike lined their eyes, painted their nails with henna, and bleached the ear hair with sun and citrus. Hair held special power wigs of braided human hair, adorned with gold thread and semi-precious stones, crowned heads during festivals or court ceremonies. The elite changed their wigs as often as their linen. Clothing was light but elegant. Sheer white robes for the day, pleated and starched to stiff perfection. More elaborate tunics embroidered with blue and gold for banquets. Sandals were fashioned from leather or papyrus, sometimes dyed red or painted with images of bound enemies, a subtle reminder of their place atop the social order. Jewelry was not simply for show, it was amulet, statement, and currency. Broad collars made of faience, carnelian, and turquoise reflected the stars and the gods. Rings bore protective symbols. Anklets, bracelets, and pectorals jingled softly as nobles moved through their marble-floored halls. The scent of myrrh followed in their wake. Meals, too, were orchestrated elegance. Breakfast might include figs, bread, and dates soaked in wine. But it was in feasts that the elite displayed their wealth and subtle maneuvering. Courtyards were transformed with linen canopies, ceramic lamps, musicians, and servants bearing trays. Ducks roasted in honey glaze, grilled catfish with coriander, lentil stews, and pyramids of pomegranates and grapes adorned low tables. Wine flowed from amphorae labeled with vintage and estate. Banquets were less about food than spectacle. Dancers twirled in gauze. Harpists strummed melodies that traced lineage to temple hymns. Poets recited verses lauding beauty, power, or scandal. Conversation was laced with double meanings. A glance could seal an alliance. A toast could unseat a rival. Nobles drank from blue-glazed goblets while keeping ears open for whispers. Behind the scenes, the household hummed with labor. Servants woke before their masters. Some were born into servitude. Others had been gifted or inherited. They polished alabaster floors, pressed linen, brewed beer, arranged fresh lotus blooms in bronze vases. Women of status often oversaw this domestic orchestra, managing inventories of linen and grain, tracking perfume stores, and preparing guest lists for social events. Marriage among the elite was less about romance and more about cementing power. Daughters of priests might wed military commanders. Landowners sought scribal families to gain influence. Wives were respected mistresses and concubines were common, but a chief wife held legal rights, managed estates, and often appeared beside her husband in tombs and inscriptions. Children were dressed in amulets, their heads shaved save for a protective sidelock. Tutors taught sons to read, calculate, and speak with grace. Daughters learned music, medicine, and the quiet politics of the home. Some women became physicians, scribes, or priestesses in their own right. Leisure was not idle. Boating parties on the Nile were popular, with nobles reclining on cushions while servants rode past fields and palms. Hunting in papyrus marshes was both sport and symbol triumph over chaos. Netting birds or spearing fish while painted in festival oils reflected not savagery, but harmony with nature. Dogs and cats were beloved companions. Monkeys, baboons, and even gazelles were kept as pets or trained performers. Gardens were status symbols, plots of green amid stone. Lotus ponds, date palms, and sycamore figs surrounded by colonnades created shaded sanctuaries. Gardeners cared for each plant with ritual precision. In these spaces, nobles read, played sonnet or mehen, or meditated on divine order. Storytelling was art. Tales of gods, riddles, or historical exploits were told over flickering lamps. Dreams were interpreted, star patterns discussed. Omens weighed. Even idle chatter echoed with the ancient. Music floated constantly. Flutes, lyres, tambourines, and sistrums accompanied prayer, rest, or celebration. Songs were passed from priestess to girl, from temple to home, morphing into lullabies or wedding chants. And everywhere, there was incense, burning at doorways, wafting from altars, infused into hair, soaked into bedding. Scents shaped memory and mood. The elite's world was enveloped in softest pillows of down, mats of woven reeds, silence broken only by fountains or wind chimes. But beneath comfort was anxiety. To fall from grace was swift. A wrong word, a failed omen, or an angry god could unmake a dynasty. Nobles consulted seers, left offerings at secret shrines, and wore charms sewn into tunics. They spoke in euphemism when discussing illness or death, believing words held power to summon what they described. Death, though, was ever present. Tombs were built long before their occupants died. Sarcophagi carved decades in advance. Burial goods acquired year-by-year ivory combs, alabaster jars, spells written in gold ink. Some nobles commissioned books of the dead tailored to their deeds, with personalized vignettes of judgment and paradise. The afterlife was not a hope, it was a destination as real as Thebes or Memphis. Inscriptions on tomb walls warned, "I have not stolen, I have not lied, I have not caused pain." These were not boasts, but spells truths that must be declared before Osiris. For all their wealth, the elite feared being denied the fields of Yaru, the paradise of reeds. And so, they prepared meticulously. In their final homes, painted with banquet scenes and boat journeys, they hoped to live forever. Their bodies were wrapped in scented linens, faces masked in gold, hearts weighed against feathers. But while they lived as gods on earth, tending beauty, preserving order, savoring the pleasures that only Egypt, eternal and mysterious, could provide. Close your eyes now. Imagine the cool marble beneath your feet, the scent of myrrh on your skin, the distant sound of a harp. The Nile flows gently, the lotus blooms, and you are surrounded by the stillness of a world designed to echo eternity. In the stillness of the ancient desert, where the winds of the Sahara whispered over the shifting sands and the stars carved eternal patterns in the sky, the ancient Egyptians contemplated death not as an end, but as a meticulous transition, a passage that demanded preparation, reverence, and sacred knowledge. To them, the afterlife was not a vague hope. It was a parallel existence, vividly mapped, ritualistically pursued, and eternally lived. This belief penetrated every layer of their culture, their art, and their breath. Life was merely the prelude. When a person died, the body was not abandoned to decay, it was honored as the vessel of the soul, worthy of preservation. Thus began the sacred art of mummification, a process more spiritual than scientific, more ceremonial than practical. Priests donned masks of Anubis, god of embalming, and performed rites that were as much magic as they were medicine. The body was washed with Nile water, symbolizing rebirth. Then came the delicate removal of the internal organs. The lungs, stomach, intestines, and liver, each placed in canopic jars topped with the heads of protective deities. The baboon-headed Hapi, the jackal Duamutef, the falcon Kebesenuef, and the human-headed Imseti. The brain, viewed as insignificant, was often discarded, while the heart believed to house thought and emotion was preserved unless replaced by a scarab amulet. The corpse was packed with natron salt to dry for 70 days, then wrapped in linen soaked with resins and oils. Incantations were whispered as amulets were placed, an eye of Horus over the chest, a dyed pillar at the spine, a scarab over the heart. Each wrap of linen was a prayer, each knot a spell. The finished mummy was not simply a preserved corpse, it was a sacred being, protected and reborn. But the soul was not yet safe. The journey through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, was perilous, filled with monstrous guardians, deceptive spirits, and trials set by the gods. The Book of the Dead, a misnamed collection of spells known to Egyptians as the Book of Coming Forth by Day, was their guide. These texts, painted on tomb walls or inscribed on papyrus scrolls, were magical instructions, passwords, and charms for surviving the hazards of the afterlife. The deceased would face gates guarded by serpents with names like "He who lives on blood" or "She who dances on bones." Each demanded a precise utterance, a spell spoken without error. Misspeaking meant destruction. There were lakes of fire, mountains of knives, and shadow beasts with crocodile jaws and lion claws. But there were also boats of light, stars that offered guidance, and fields of reeds, lush and endless, waiting for those who passed the tests. At the heart of this journey was the Hall of Two Truths. Here, the soul would be judged by Osiris, Lord of the Dead, seated upon his black throne flanked by Isis and Nephthys. The heart of the deceased was weighed on a golden scale against the feather of Ma'at, the principle of cosmic order. Thoth, the ibis-headed scribe, recorded the result. If the heart was lighter than the feather, the soul passed into the paradise of the field of reeds, where one could fish, plow, and feast for eternity. But if it was heavy with sin, if the soul had lied, stolen, or dishonored the gods it was thrown to emit, the devourer, a terrifying beast part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus. To be devoured by Amit was to cease to exist, a fate worse than death, total annihilation. Protection against such a fate required more than piety, it demanded magic. Tombs were inscribed with protective spells. Names of demons were written backwards to confuse them. Some spells called upon ancient gods lost to time gods with no temples, only whispered names. Others spoke in riddles, or contained secret syllables that could not be translated. Amulets, too, were vital. The Tayat knot of Isis, the Ujat eye, the Shen ring each bore divine power, activated through ritual. Some mummies were wrapped in hundreds of these symbols, magical armor woven into the fabric of eternity. Families left food offerings at tombs long after burial, bread, beer, onions, and dried meats. They lit incense and poured libations, believing the Ka, the life force, still hungered. Priests recited litanies, not only to honor the dead, but to keep their names alive. For in Egypt, to be forgotten was a second death. Tomb walls often bore the deceased's own voice. "Say my name, that I may live again." Yet the fear of malevolent forces lingered. Ghosts were real to the Egyptians, especially the restless ones, those who had died violently or been buried without ritual. They could bring misfortune, illness, or madness. To appease them, letters to the dead were left in tombs, asking forgiveness or aid. Some sought the intercession of powerful spirits, deified ancestors, or royal ghosts who might intervene with the gods. Dreams were portals. The dead visited the living in them, offering warnings or revelations. Dream manuals existed, cataloging symbols. If one dreamed of a snake, it meant wealth. Of teeth falling out, it meant a death in the family. But if a dream repeated, it was believed a spirit was trying to speak. There were professional dream interpreters, often priests or wise women, who could divine these nocturnal messages. Necromancy, though not widely practiced, existed in hidden circles. Certain texts whispered of opening the mouth of the dead to ask questions. This dangerous art was condemned by many temples, but sought by desperate individuals seeking lost knowledge or revenge. Temples themselves were gates to the afterlife. Within their sanctuaries, rituals mirrored those in the tomb. Daily rites for the god paralleled the care given to mummies: washing, anointing, dressing, feeding. The gods and the dead were treated with the same reverence. The temple's Holy of Holies was a tomb of stone for a living deity. In private homes, small shrines housed images of Osiris, Anubis, or the household's dead. Incense was burned at dawn and dusk. Offerings were made. Names were chanted. Protection spells were spoken over children at night, often invoking Bes, the dwarf god of joy and terror, who warded off nightmares and evil spirits. In more remote villages, ancient traditions endured rituals not found in official texts. People buried blue faience figurines in thresholds, painted protective eyes on boats, and placed scorpions in jars beneath floors to ward off desert jinn. They whispered stories of shadow beings who walked in sandstorms, of jackals who spoke in riddles, of stars that blinked messages from the gods. And above all, they feared being buried without proper rites. Even the poorest begged for a priest, a shroud, and the utterance of their name. For without these, their soul might wander eternally, unable to find Osiris or the field of reeds. Death in Egypt was never just a moment. It was a process, a negotiation, a ritual of immense complexity. It was sacred theater, where the stakes were eternal and the audience divine. Close your eyes, listen to the wind across the tombs. Smell the resins in the air. Imagine your heart, small and warm, being weighed against a feather. And know that in this land of sun and silence, death was never feared, only misunderstood. Beneath the golden sun and among the narrow alleys of mud-brick villages, where the Nile's slow breath nourished the land and time moved like the currents beneath its reeds, the ancient Egyptians carried with them not only their gods but their fears, and to meet those fears, they wielded magic, an ancient, instinctive force, known not merely as illusion or ritual but as an active, living power called Heka. Magic in Egypt was not confined to temples or tombs. It lived in kitchens, in cradles, and in the very dust of their homes. It was as essential as air, water, and bread. Every household, regardless of wealth, kept charms and spells to protect against the invisible. A mother would whisper incantations over her sleeping child, drawing protective symbols in the air with her finger. Fathers etched eyes of Horus into doorframes. Old women crushed dried herbs and resins into powders believed to ward off demons. Children wore amulets shaped like fish, cats, or turtles, each imbued with silent spells passed down from generation to generation. These weren't simply traditions, they were lifelines. Evil spirits, known as Aku, or Mut demons, were believed to wander at dusk and just before sunrise. These spirits, some vengeful dead, others ancient forces of chaos, could enter the home if left unguarded. So thresholds were swept clean daily, not merely for cleanliness but to disrupt evil tracks. Shoes were left outside to confuse spirits, and door lintels were washed with salt water mixed with natron. The humble kitchen, where bread was baked and onions boiled, doubled as a space of ritual. Certain herbs like juniper, mint, or garlic were not only seasoning but spells in plant form. Burned over hot coals, they were believed to cleanse the home of lingering shadows. Even the act of cooking had sacred rhythms. Stirring a pot clockwise 3 times with a copper spoon might bring good health, while stirring counterclockwise could reverse a curse if spoken words accompanied it. In more secluded regions, peasants spoke of desert spirits, with names long since forgotten by scribes' figures cloaked in smoke, riding the backs of scorpions or hidden in the cries of birds at twilight. To guard against these, figurines of Bez the Squat, lion-faced god of households, were placed above beds and hearths. Sometimes his image was carved into the bottom of bowls. Drinking from them ensured the god's gaze passed through the liquid into the soul. Tattoos of protective symbols were inked on the thighs or shoulders of women, hidden beneath linen robes, activated through dance or touch. These marks were often private, a line of blue stars down the back, a tiny falcon near the heart, a lotus blossom on the ankle, each tied to a spell known only to the wearer. But magic was not only defensive. When crops failed or water levels fell, people sought out local magicians, or Heka practitioners, who mixed clay, papyrus, and spoken word into force. These village spellcasters knew the secret names of animals, the pathways of the stars, and the hidden ingredients in temple incense. They would draw spells in the dirt, write curses in red ink, or craft wax figurines to be melted over fires or buried beneath thresholds. Red ink was vital, it symbolized danger, the blood of Seth, and the reversal of harm. It was used to name enemies, to bind spirits, and to mark offerings to the gods of vengeance. If a neighbor was suspected of cursing your home, a figurine might be created in their likeness, pierced with copper needles and buried upside down at a crossroads, where the wind of 4 directions could scatter their power. The Egyptian fear of the spoken word was potent. To name a thing was to give it form. This is why secret names existed. Every person had their Ren, a true name known only to the gods. To speak someone's Ren with malice could injure their soul. Some families hid their children's true names until they reached adulthood. Even the gods were guarded in this way. Isis herself learned the secret name of Ra and gained dominion over him not by force, but by trickery, a spell, and a snake made from his own spit. In the realm of healing, magic and medicine walked hand in hand. Physicians were also magicians, and every illness had a physical and spiritual cause. A fever might be the result of bad water or a spirit's breath. The cure could be herbs and a poultice, but it might also require a spell, chanted over 7 knots tied in reed. The knots would then be burned, carrying the illness away in smoke. Some scrolls recorded spells for childbirth, written in trembling script, filled with images of goddesses like Hathor and Taweret. Women in labor clutched wooden wands carved with lions, cobras, and frogs. These magic knives weren't for cutting but for protection, held like talismans in the clenched hands of the midwife. Love spells, too, were whispered across the Nile. A lonely youth might crush carnelian and mix it with honey, smearing it across a scrap of linen with a lover's name, burying it beneath her threshold in hopes of stirring her heart. These were not manipulations, but desires made sacred. Longing turned ritual. But among all spells, the most feared and sought after were the curses. These weren't idle threats, they were complex, often hidden inside tombs or inscribed in invisible ink. Tomb curses warned of crocodiles devouring trespassers, of scorpions in the eyes, of madness and lost names. And while modern scholars often dismiss them as superstition, even robbers feared them. Some wore amulets, recited counterspells, or brought animals as offerings before digging into the earth. But curses existed in daily life too. A broken friendship, a betrayal, a theft, all could warrant a personal curse. These were often written on ostraca shards of pottery and left at sacred sites or burned in sacred fire. The very act of righting a wrong was a magical reeve, arsal. And in some cities, entire libraries of such shards were discovered, layered with emotion, pain, and vengeance. Children were taught early how to protect themselves. They learned lullabies that doubled as spells. Stories of Set and Horus became lessons on loyalty and trickery. They knew never to whistle after dark, never to sleep with feet pointing west, never to say a dead man's name without salt on the tongue. Even dreams were treated with reverence. Waking from a nightmare, a child might draw it in the sand and trample it underfoot, erasing its power. Elders would interpret patterns in smoke, ripples in milk, or the path of a beetle across the floor. Everything meant something. And in this endless conversation with the unseen world, the Egyptians built their resilience. Their magic wasn't theatrical, it was embedded, constant, humming beneath the surface of daily life. In fields, farmers scattered ash in patterns before planting. In rivers, fishermen painted boats with eyes. In shops, merchants counted coins thrice, muttering blessings. Magic was not just belief, it was maintenance. A thread sewn into the fabric of reality to keep it from unraveling. Close your eyes. Imagine the soft flicker of an oil lamp, the scent of frankincense, the quiet murmur of an ancient spell passed from mother to daughter. In that hush, across millennia, their voices still speak not in thunder or fire, but in the whisper of linen, the crackle of salt, and the naming of shadows. In the land of eternal sun and shadowed tombs, death was not an end. It was a transition, a passage, a sacred journey through a realm more vast and perilous than life itself. To the ancient Egyptians, dying was only the beginning of an odyssey that stretched into the winding corridors of Duat, the underworld, where gods and monsters waited behind every bend, and where the soul would be tested, judged, and, if prepared, reborn among the stars. But to begin this journey, one had to be made ready, not just spiritually, but physically, ritually, and cosmically. This was the domain of the embalmers, those who knew the language of preservation, who worked in the quiet outskirts of cities in low, whitewashed buildings thick with the scent of resins, incense, and natron. When someone died, their family did not simply grieve, they acted. The process began within hours. Priests and embalmers were summoned, and the body was carried discreetly to the house of purification. There, in a space cloaked in linen and silence, the transformation would begin. First came the washing. The body was bathed in Nile water mixed with sacred oils. Every motion was deliberate. Every gesture, echoing an ancient choreography, meant not only to clean, but to sanctify. Next, the brain, thought useless to the Egyptians, was removed through the nostrils with long bronze hooks. The heart, however, was left inside or carefully wrapped and placed back within, for it was believed to be the seat of the soul and conscience. Without it, one could not be judged in the Hall of Two Truths. The internal organs were removed and placed in 4 canopic jars, each guarded by a son of Horus Seti, Hapi, Duamutef, and Kebe-Senuf, who watched over the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines. These jars were not simple containers. They were miniature altars, imbued with spells, often buried alongside the body in ornate chests. The cavity of the body was then filled with linens soaked in resins, spices, and sawdust. The body itself was packed in natron, a desiccating salt, for 40 days, mirroring the mythic duration of divine transformations. When dried, the skin took on a leathery sheen. The features tightened but remained recognizable. It was not a corpse, it was a vessel. Wrapping followed. This was not a hurried task. It was a ceremony in itself, lasting up to 2 weeks. Each finger and toe was wrapped individually, then the limbs, then the torso, and finally the head. Amulets were inserted between layers of linen scarabs for rebirth, eyes of Horus for protection, knots of Isis for binding harm. Some mummies were wrapped in over 300 meters of cloth. Priests, masked as Anubis, intoned spells from the Book of the Dead, or more precisely, the Book of Coming Forth by Day, a collection of hymns, instructions, and declarations meant to guide the soul through Duat. These texts were not merely read, they were inscribed on tomb walls, written on papyrus scrolls placed between the mummy's legs, or even etched into the bandages themselves. The most famous spell, Spell 125, instructed the deceased on how to address the 42 assessors of the underworld, reciting the negative confessions. I have not stolen, I have not lied, I have not slain without cause. Each line was a key, each virtue a shield. Once wrapped, the body was placed in a wooden coffin, painted with hieroglyphs, eyes, and scenes from the journey ahead. For the wealthy, this coffin was nested within others, like protective shells, each layer more elaborate than the last. The outermost coffin was often anthropoid, shaped and painted in the image of the deceased, with a serene face and hands crossed in eternal repose. Funerary masks, made from cartonnage or gold, were placed upon the face, preserving identity and guiding the Ba, the part of the soul with human consciousness, toward the afterlife. On the day of burial, a procession formed. Relatives, mourners, priests, and musicians walked alongside the coffin. Women with loosened hair wailed and tore their garments, channeling the grief of Isis and Nephthys mourning Osiris. Statues, models, and offerings were carried furniture, sandals, food, and miniature servants known as shabti, who would work in the afterlife in place of the dead. At the tomb, the opening of the mouth ritual was performed. A priest touched the mouth and eyes of the mummy with sacred instruments, a ceremonial adze, a reed, a piece of metal to restore the senses of speech, sight, breath, and hunger. Without this rite, the soul would be mute in Duat. The tomb itself was a universe. Its walls were covered with paintings of the journey boats on celestial rivers, gates guarded by serpents, trials overseen by lion-headed gods. The ceilings depicted stars. The floors showed fertile earth. Food offerings were placed in niches. Bread, beer, onions, figs, and sometimes meat, all arranged in ceramic vessels. Magic bricks were embedded into the walls, each inscribed with spells to protect against intruders, decay, and even forgotten memory. But the true journey began after burial. The soul split into parts. The Ka, the life force, remained near the tomb, fed by offerings. The Ba, the personality, flew like a bird, returning each night. The transfigured spirit, was the goal, the ultimate, eternal form, radiant and enduring. Yet to reach this, the soul had to traverse Duat. This underworld was not a place of torment, but of challenge. It had 12 hours, each an ordeal. In the first hours, the soul crossed the river of fire, where gods on serpent boats warded off the chaos serpent Apophis. The soul had to speak spells, identify gatekeepers, answer riddles. A wrong word could banish it to darkness. In the 6th hour, it reached the cavern of Sokar, a silent realm where time collapsed. Here, the soul floated in endless night, guided only by faith and ritual. Past that, the landscape twisted fields of reeds, lakes of fire, mountains with human faces, halls where crocodiles walked upright, and cats read scrolls. The final trial was judgment. In the hall of Ma'at, the soul stood before Osiris, flanked by Isis, Nephthys, and 42 divine judges. The heart was placed on a scale, balanced against the feather of Ma'at truth, justice, cosmic order. If the heart was lighter, the soul passed, embraced by Osiris, given land to till in the field of reeds. If heavier, it was devoured by Emmet, a chimera of crocodile, lion, and hippo, ceasing to exist forever. Those who passed were reborn daily with Ra, traveling across the sky in his solar bark. They joined the blessed dead, watching over the living, whispering through dreams, appearing in the flight of birds or the rustle of sycamores. Death was not feared, but prepared for with love, effort, and artistry. Every ritual, every jar, every spell was an act of care, ensuring that even in the silence of the tomb, the soul would not be alone. The ancient Egyptians did not conquer death. They befriended it, wrapped it in linen, named it, and gave it a story. Close your eyes now. Hear the rustle of bandages, the quiet chant of priests, the soft scratch of a scribe's reed against papyrus. Beyond the veil, the boat awaits. The stars shimmer above, and in the hush of eternity, a name is spoken and remembered. As the golden sands of the Nile whispered through time and the pyramids watched the ages pass in patient silence, Egypt, so timeless in its rituals, its gods, and its sun-scorched certainty, began to change. The old world did not vanish in a single moment. It unraveled slowly, thread by thread, as foreign tongues echoed through Thebes and Alexandria, as new banners fluttered above old temples, and as the divine order that once pulsed through every stone and shadow grew quiet. By the time the last pharaoh of native blood, Nectanebo II, stood against the advancing Persians in 343 BCE, Egypt had already weathered waves of conquest and transition. Libyans had ruled the land, blending their tribal gods with Egyptian pantheons. Nubians had swept north from Kush, embracing Amun and reviving rituals long neglected, but none would leave a deeper imprint than the Greeks. When Alexander the Great entered Egypt in 332 BCE, the people did not resist. They welcomed him as a liberator, perhaps even as a god. He stood at the temple of Amun in Siwa, and the oracle proclaimed him son of Zeus Amun. It was not just flattery, it was synthesis. From that moment, Hellenic and Egyptian thought became entangled in a tapestry of blended belief. Alexandria rose from the coast, a city of marble and papyrus, of lighthouses and libraries. Greek philosophers walked among Egyptian priests, translating hymns, decoding symbols, preserving knowledge even as they reinterpreted it. The Ptolemaic dynasty, founded by one of Alexander's generals, ruled not as distant overlords, but as pharaohs garbed in linen crowns, worshipping Egyptian gods, inscribing their names in hieroglyphs. Yet something subtle shifted. Temples still thrummed with incense and prayer, but the gods had changed. Serapis, a deity born from Greek and Egyptian theology, was worshipped in grand halls lit with oil lamps and adorned with statues that bore both Greek beards and Egyptian ankhs. Isis found new followers across the Mediterranean. Her cult, once bound to Nile festivals and lunar calendars, spread to Rome, Gaul, even Britannia. She became a goddess not of a single people, but of the known world. But power moved west. When Octavian defeated Cleopatra and Mark Antony at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, Egypt became a Roman province. The temples still functioned, but their patrons now wore togas. The priests still chanted, but they did so in fading voices. Latin mixed with Coptic. Scrolls grew brittle. Stone walls no longer rang with the names of Osiris or Horus. Instead, the faces of emperors were carved into the stones of Karnak. Yet the rituals endured. Even in the shadow of Rome, the art of mummification continued. Animal cults persisted: ibises embalmed for Thoth, cats for Bastet, crocodiles for Sobek. The Phaeum portraits, painted with Greek realism on the faces of mummies, showed a people navigating dual identities: Greek in appearance, Egyptian in soul. But the old gods were not eternal. With the rise of Christianity, temples were shuttered. Edicts from emperors forbade the sacrifices, the processions, the reading of sacred texts. Paganism was not merely discouraged, it was erased. The Temple of Philae, last stronghold of Isis's worship, fell silent in the 6th century. The statues were broken or buried. The priests vanished into obscurity, and with them, the language of the gods. Hieroglyphs, once read by thousands, became indecipherable. Obelisks stood mute in sunlit plazas, their meanings lost. The Rosetta Stone, carved in 196 BCE, held the key, but none could yet use it. Egypt became a land of ruins and legends. Travelers marveled at the pyramids without understanding them. Local guides spun tales of treasure and curses. Arab scholars recorded fragments of knowledge, but the deeper truths slept beneath sand and time. It was not until Napoleon's campaign in 1798 that a new chapter began. Among his soldiers marched savant scientists, artists, linguists who documented everything they saw. Temples were sketched, artifacts cataloged, and, most importantly, the Rosetta Stone was rediscovered. When Jean-François Champollion deciphered it in 1822, the silence of 2,000 years was broken. The voices of Ramses, Hatshepsut, and Akhenaten returned. The gods spoke once more. Egyptology was born not as a resurrection, but as a reverent listening. Western scholars flocked to Luxor, Saqqara, Abydos. Tombs were opened, often clumsily, sometimes greedily. Mummies were unwrapped in parlors. Artifacts were spirited away to European museums. Yet beneath this frenzy of discovery lay awe. The deeper archaeologists dug, the more they realized how little they understood. Every cartouche, every broken shard, whispered of a civilization that had mastered the stars, the soul, and the stories that outlast death. Temples were no longer just ruins, they were blueprints of the cosmos. Tombs were not graves, they were gateways. Myth became history. The Book of the Dead, once dismissed as superstition, was studied as literature, psychology, astronomy, and still, the questions remained. How did they align the pyramids so precisely? Why were certain gods worshipped for millennia without change? How did a society so obsessed with death live so beautifully? Tourists now walk where pharaohs once tread. Cruise ships float where papyrus skiffs once drifted. But some things do not change. The Nile still floods. The stars still rise in the same patterns. And in quiet corners of temples, one can still find inscriptions untouched by time. They tell of offerings given, of prayers whispered, of gods who wait patiently for remembrance. For Egypt never truly died. It transformed. It was carried in the stories of Copts, preserved in the designs of mosques built atop ancient stones, echoed in the eyes of children who play among ruins, dreaming of golden masks and hidden chambers. In our age of technology, we gaze at the same constellations the ancient astronomers did. We ask the same questions. Who are we? Where do we go when we die? What lies beyond the veil? The ancient Egyptians offered answers not as doctrine, but as poetry. They carved eternity into walls, wrapped love in linen, and dared to imagine a world where nothing was truly lost. As you rest now, let those dreams carry you. Let the wind over the desert dunes become your lullaby. Let the stars above Karnak shine into your thoughts. For you walk a path once trodden by kings and priests, by scribes and servants. The gods may slumber, but the story continues. And in the hush of night, if you listen closely, you might still hear a hymn to Isis, rising softly from the shadows, across the long corridors of time, even as the mighty Nile quieted its voice, and the temples surrendered to sand and shadow. Ancient Egypt refused to vanish. Instead, it transformed, becoming not merely a subject of memory, but a haunting echo in the cultural, spiritual, and artistic veins of civilization. In dusty libraries of Europe, in secret societies, in the dreams of painters, poets, and mystics, the legacy of Egypt found strange new homes. The Enlightenment, that age of reason and revolution, did not discard Egypt, it revered it. For as reason grew, so too did fascination with the irrational, the mysterious, the sublime. Egypt represented both ancient knowledge and unknowable depth. Scholars like Athanasius Kircher pored over hieroglyphs with wild theories, imagining them as keys to universal truth. Freemasons traced their symbolic rituals to imagined Egyptian initiations. The Eye of Horus appeared on currency. Obelisks, those tall, tapering testaments to sun and sky, rose again. Not in Karnak, but in Paris, London, and Washington, D.C. Their meanings were often misunderstood, yet their presence was undeniable. They reminded the modern world that Egypt, though fallen, still stood. Artists, too, found inspiration. The neoclassical era saw sphinxes perched beside fountains and pharaohs etched into chandeliers. Writers penned romantic odes to Cleopatra, and tales of hidden tombs cursed with eternal sleep. The Gothic imagination embraced Egypt as a realm of silent grandeur and sleeping terror. Victorian England, with its insatiable appetite for the exotic, turned Egypt into theater. Museums staged mummy unwrappings, grim performances where ancient dead were stripped of linen and dignity before gasping audiences. Some believed in ancient curses, others in ancient wisdom. The line between respect and spectacle blurred. Egypt was no longer just a place, it was an idea. The birth of cinema brought that idea to glowing life. Hollywood, in its golden age, cast Egypt in shadow and gold. Films like The Ten Commandments, Cleopatra, and The Mummy recast pharaohs as tyrants or tragic lovers, gods as menacing deities, and tombs as glittering traps. Though historically flawed, these films embedded Egypt into the modern psyche. Sand, stone, and scarabs became icons. Even cartoons and adventure tales echoed with pyramids and golden idols. Egypt became shorthand for ancient mystery. In the spiritual realm, Egypt's influence deepened. The 20th century occult revival leaned heavily on Egyptian imagery. Tarot cards included the Ankh, the Ibis, the throne of Isis. Aleister Crowley and the Thelemites adopted Egyptian gods into their cosmology. Ra, Nuit, and Hadit became symbols of inner transformation. Egypt, once the land of orderly rituals and precise cosmology, was now a mirror for modern mystics seeking transcendence. Even mainstream religions felt Egypt's pulse. Christianity preserved echoes of Egyptian theology. The Madonna cradling child recalls Isis and Horus. The concept of resurrection resonates with Osiris's myth. The monastic desert fathers walked the same sands as ancient priests. In Islam, too, Egypt held reverence not just as a land of prophets like Moses and Joseph, but as a center of learning. Al-Azhar University in Cairo, one of the oldest in the world, carries Egypt's intellectual torch into the present. Architecturally, Egypt left fingerprints across continents. The Washington Monument is an obelisk. The Louvre's pyramid glints in Parisian glass. In cemeteries, mausoleums rise in the style of temples. In banks and courthouses, lotus columns and solar discs silently preside. Egypt's geometry became a visual language of power and permanence. In literature, Egypt continued to beguile. Agatha Christie's set, Among Ancient Tombs. E. A. Wallace Budge carefully translated spells and hymns. Imaginary archaeologists searched for relics through ever-shifting sands. The mummy became a symbol for restraint, for historical reflection, for the challenge of memory. Yet Egypt was never forgotten. Around the world, children learn about pyramids and pharaohs. Textbooks and documentaries keep alive names like Nefertiti, Akhenaten, and Tutankhamun. Howard Carter's 1922 discovery of Tutankhamun's nearly intact tomb was not only an archaeological success, it was a renewal. Gold gleamed beneath desert dust. The young king's serene face attracted worldwide attention. Suddenly, Egypt became more than history. It became a treasure. Visitors arrived in great numbers. Museums displayed relics in glass cases. Egyptology became a profession, with ongoing debates about chronology, interpretation, and ethics. Modern Egyptians live with this heritage. For them, ancient Egypt is both distant and close. It appears in street names and motifs, in pride of ancestry, balancing past and present. Some regard it as national heritage, others as spiritual tradition. Festivals like Sham el-Nessim echo pre-Christian, pre-Islamic customs. The Nile, though dammed and bridged, continues its ancient rhythm. Social media brought a new generation to the temples. TikToks near sphinxes, Instagram reels from Luxor modern technology capturing millennia-old wonders. Digital reconstructions allow anyone to explore Karnak or Saqqara virtually. Augmented reality overlays ancient paths on modern streets. Yet despite progress, the heart of Egypt remains subtle. For every inscription translated, many remain undiscovered. For every tomb opened, others wait. And always, there is the mystery not only of knowledge, but of feeling. The quiet of the hypostyle hall, the silence of a sealed sarcophagus, the wonder of standing beneath a pyramid built by hands like yours, minds like yours, hopes like yours. Egypt teaches that civilization is fragile but enduring, that stories shape stone, and that memory is a kind of lasting presence. As you drift to sleep, carry this memory with you. In dreams, walk beside scribes painting spells in blue ink, or follow priests into chambers lit only by stars. Place a lotus at the feet of a forgotten god, or watch the sun rise, as it always has, over timeless lands. The story continues. The sands still speak. Across the long corridors of time, beneath shifting sands and silent stone statues that have watched millennia pass, the story of ancient Egypt does not end. It becomes quieter, gentler, more inward, retreating into dreams, imagination, and quiet respect. As the final chapter unfolds, we no longer search for new tombs or decipher unknown hieroglyphs. Instead, we listen, not with tools, but with breath, stillness, and a calm matching the eternal rhythm of the Nile. Egypt was never just a nation or timeline, it remains a mindset, a worldview wrapped in ritual, mystery, and precision. Its myths told not only what gods did, but how humans live in harmony with stars, floods, and silence. Its pharaohs were caretakers of balance, Ma'at, guiding justice and order. In this closing meditation, revisit symbols resonating across centuries. The Ankh, the looped cross, was more than an amulet. It represented life itself, not just breath, but energy flowing between worlds. When seen on jewelry, tattoos, or digital art, you touch a current older than Rome, Greece, or writing. The scarab rolling its ball of earth across sands mirrored the sun god Ra bringing daylight, a humble beetle and cosmic force. In every burial, the scarab spoke a silent spell of renewal and protection. Today, it reminds us to notice the small and overlooked, and the pyramid needing no explanation. Triangular, grounded, pointing skyward, echoing balance, eternity, aspiration. Built with precision, aligned with stars and solstices, pyramids remain among humanity's most enduring creations. Their meaning shifts tombs, temples, sources of energy, metaphors, but their presence is constant. More than relics, reminders. Painted eyes on sarcophagi look outward. not in fear, but in knowing. They are witnesses. They observed time collapse, empires fall, visitors arrive with cameras. Still, they remain watching. The Book of the Dead, a collection of spells and guidance, was not a book about death at all, but about continuity, ethical clarity, and the journey of the soul. In it, hearts were weighed against feathers, and truth mattered more than wealth. What modern text teaches this with such poetry? As the modern world spirals in complexity, Egypt's ancient vision offers a counterpoint, a world where time was cyclical, not linear, where each season echoed the next, and where death was not an end, but a procession of preparation and return. Even the gods, with their animal heads and serene poise, were not distant overlords, but intimate forces, Thoth guiding your thoughts, Hathor offering beauty and music, Sekhmet roaring when balance was broken. In modern cities far from the Nile, people light candles beside images of Isis. Scholars retranslate ancient prayers. Children draw pyramids in school. Travelers stand in awe beside columns taller than dreams. And in that moment, the wall between centuries dissolves. One doesn't need belief to feel it, only stillness. To stand in Egypt, physically or in memory, is to feel the slow exhale of time. It reminds us that empires end, but meaning does not. That stories fade, but symbols endure. That humans lived, loved, and died beneath the same stars we now barely see. As you lie back, sinking into rest, let your mind drift through temple gates carved with lotus flowers. Let warm sand slip beneath your feet. Let the chants of priests fade into a hush. Hear the creak of an oar slicing through the Nile at dusk. See the torchlight flicker against alabaster walls. Smell the faint perfume of blue lotus. Perhaps you glimpse the shadow of a scribe brushing ink onto papyrus, or the gentle sway of a priestess placing bread beside a god's statue. Maybe you find yourself in a sunlit courtyard, listening to distant music, watching herons glide overhead, or walking alone through endless corridors where every surface whispers names once spoken with reverence. Do not rush, do not interpret, let it pass through you. Let the ancient silence speak in its own language. Tonight, as your thoughts settle and your breathing slows, know that you've walked through not just history, but memory, imagination, and something older than either. You've traced the arc of a civilization not by fact alone, but by tone, image, and presence. Egypt remains not as a kingdom to be conquered, but as a feeling to be remembered. The stars that crowned its ceilings still shine. The wind that shaped its dunes still blows. And in the space between sleep and waking, you are not a visitor, you are a part of it. Close your eyes. The story lingers. The Nile flows on.